Good evening and welcome back to another quiet night of drifting off into the past. Tonight we are traveling to the glittering, suffocating, endlessly fascinating world of one man who convinced an entire nation that he was, quite literally, the center of the universe. We are talking about Louis XIV of France, the Sun King. Not the marble bust version, not the powdered wig on a coin. The real man, sweating through velvet in the height of summer, surrounded by hundreds of people who considered it the highlight of their week just to watch him put on his socks. Before we settle in, if you're enjoying these long, slow wanders through history, consider subscribing so future episodes find their way to you. And thank you sincerely to everyone who leaves suggestions for future topics. I read all of them, and tonight's journey exists because of you. Feel free to drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what time it is where you are. It's always something a little ridiculous, like 2:30 in the morning somewhere. This channel is also available on Spotify now, if you'd rather just close your eyes and listen without a screen in the room. And if you ever want more of this to fall asleep to, the channel membership includes extended, uninterrupted hours of content built just for drifting off. Now dim the lights, let a fan hum somewhere in the background, sink into the pillow, and let's begin. Tonight I want you to imagine something odd. Imagine being so powerful that entire wars start and stop because of a signature you make, and yet so utterly without privacy that you cannot even wake up in the morning without an audience. Imagine spending 72 years on a throne, so long that generations of your own family die before you do. Imagine building a palace out of a swamp because you never wanted to feel powerless again. Tonight, you are Louis XIV, and your story begins not with power, but with an almost impossible birth. You arrive in the world on September the 5th, 1638, at the royal chateau of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, and the news detonates across France like a cannon. Your parents, King Louis XIII and Queen Anne of Austria, have been married for 23 years without a single surviving heir. 2 decades of disappointment, whispered scandal, and quiet despair had settled over the French court like dust. By the time you are conceived, most of the kingdom has stopped expecting a miracle and started dreading what happens to France without one. And then, astonishingly, you are born healthy and squalling into the arms of relieved attendants. The people of France do not simply celebrate, they lose their minds with joy. Bells ring out from church towers across the kingdom. Strangers embrace in the streets. Poets who have never met you compose verses in your honor, because nothing motivates a court poet quite like the birth of a king and the promise of a commission. You are given the name Louis Dieudonné, Louis, the God-given, because an ordinary name simply will not do for a child this improbable. Before you can hold up your own head, you are already being described as a gift from heaven itself. Being a royal infant, however, is less a fairy tale and more a permanent state of low-grade panic for everyone around you. A team of physicians, nurses, and anxious officials monitors your every breath, your every cough, your every meal, because infant mortality in the 17th century respects no crown. You are quite literally the entire future of the French monarchy contained inside one small, fragile body, and everyone around you knows it. It is a strange kind of importance, being simultaneously adored and treated like the single most fragile object in the kingdom. 2 years later, your parents manage a second miracle. A younger brother, Philippe, arrives, and the kingdom exhales a little further. Now there is a spare heir, some insurance against the cruelty of 17th century childhood. You and Philippe will grow up together in a strange, gilded, sometimes tense companionship that will follow both of you for the rest of your lives, but that story comes later. What matters most in these earliest years is the idea planted into you before you could possibly understand it, that you are not simply a prince, but a walking proof of divine favor. That belief will settle into your bones, and decades later, when real power is finally placed into your hands, it will either be the greatest source of confidence a monarch has ever had, or the single most dangerous idea anyone ever handed a child. Possibly both. But miracle children still have to grow up, and yours is about to be interrupted far sooner than anyone expected, because the man meant to guide you into kingship is running out of time. Your father dies in May of 1643. You are 4 years old, and just like that, you are the king of France. Most boys your age are being taught not to bite their siblings. You are being taught how to hold still while grown men in mourning black lower themselves to the floor in front of you. Picture the scene properly. An enormous hall filled with the most powerful figures in the kingdom, dukes, generals, bishops, all bowing to a child who has only recently mastered walking without falling over. You do not understand war. You do not understand taxation. You barely understand death, which is unfortunate, because the entire reason this room is bowing to you is that your father has just died of it. Nobody consults you on whether you'd like to be king. Nobody needs to. The crown simply lands on you, the way weather lands on a field. Naturally, nobody expects a 4-year-old to actually govern. A regency is arranged, and real authority passes into the hands of your mother, Anne of Austria, a woman who spent over 2 decades being quietly dismissed by a court that assumed she would never produce an heir, and who now, virtually overnight, becomes the most powerful person in France. It is one of history's more satisfying reversals. The overlooked queen suddenly holding the reins of the entire kingdom, all because her miracle son cannot yet reach the stirrups on his own. Meanwhile, you are dressed in miniature royal costumes, paraded through ceremonies, and taught the very difficult art of sitting still and looking dignified. A genuinely tall order for a small child whose main talents at this stage involve tripping over furniture. The court watches you constantly, not out of warmth, but calculation. Everyone in that glittering room is quietly asking the same question. What kind of king will this boy become? And more importantly, who gets to control him while he figures that out? Here is the quiet sadness tucked beneath all the pageantry. You never really get a childhood in any sense we would recognize. There are no unsupervised afternoons, no ordinary boyhood mistakes made in private. Every moment is observed, recorded and folded into the machinery of state. Even your games have witnesses. You are, from your very first conscious memory, both a person and a national symbol, and the symbol part of you never gets a day off. The astonishing thing is that the crown itself is genuinely, almost unimaginably powerful. It is simply that, for now, the power belongs to the grown-ups circling your throne, and some of them are considerably more interested in their own ambitions than in yours. You are the king of France, and you cannot yet tie your own shoes, and there are people in this palace who are counting on that gap lasting as long as humanly possible. Which brings us to the man who filled that gap, and who, without ever intending to, taught you everything you would eventually need to take your kingdom back from him. Since you are far too young to rule, the actual running of France falls to your mother, and to a smooth, endlessly patient Italian cardinal named Jules Mazarin, a man who becomes, almost by accident, the single most important teacher of your life. Mazarin is a fascinating creature, Italian-born in a fiercely nationalistic French court, a clergyman who is far more interested in politics than in prayer, and a diplomat so skilled he could talk his way out of a locked room and somehow leave with the key as a gift. He inherits his position from the legendary and terrifying Cardinal Richelieu, your father's old chief minister, which is a bit like being handed the keys to a haunted mansion by its most famous ghost. Enormous shoes to fill, and an entire court watching to see if he can manage it. His partnership with your mother is close, so close that the entire court spends years gossiping about whether the two of them are secretly married, secretly in love, or simply the most effective political alliance in Europe. Nobody ever finds out for certain, and honestly, the mystery suits them both just fine. What matters is that together, they hold France together through your long childhood, fending off rival factions, managing costly wars, and keeping your throne warm until you are old enough to sit on it properly, whether the nobility likes it or not. Spoiler, the nobility does not like it, not even slightly. Mazarin's true gift is patience. Where lesser men shout, he smiles. Where others reach for swords, he writes letters, arranges convenient marriages, and quietly buys off his rivals until they've practically forgotten why they were angry in the first place. He plays every game as though he has all the time in the world, and more often than not, he wins a proof, 17th century style, that the calmest person in the room usually ends up owning it. And you, meanwhile, are the most attentive student in France, though nobody is officially teaching you this particular subject. You sit quietly through council meetings, watching Mazarin handle a furious nobleman with nothing but flattery, delay, and a well-placed compliment that leaves the man feeling as though he'd won something. You notice how information is hoarded like treasure. You notice how a well-timed silence can cut deeper than any shouted argument. Your formal Latin lessons may bore you into a stupor, but this you absorb like a sponge, the way an apprentice studies a master craftsman at work. There is, of course, a cost to all of this. Mazarin is spectacularly, almost impressively unpopular. Ordinary people blame him for crushing taxes. Noblemen resent an outsider holding the true levers of French power. To much of the country, he is simply a greedy foreign schemer squeezing the kingdom dry for his own benefit. And that resentment does not stay politely contained in whispered conversation. It builds, it festers, and eventually it erupts into open rebellion, turning your childhood from gilded to genuinely terrifying. But before we get there, understand what this strange, sly cardinal really gave you. Not warmth exactly, and certainly not the childhood a boy might have dreamed of. What he gave you, day after day, without ever meaning to, was proof that power belongs not to the loudest voice or the largest army, but to whoever understands the game most completely. He taught you to wait, to watch, and to strike only when the moment is absolutely perfect. The moment your patience would finally be tested came sooner than anyone expected, and it began with you being smuggled out of your own capital in the freezing dark, running from your own people. Let's talk about the Fronde, the long, chaotic, deeply unpleasant rebellion that turns your boyhood from merely strange into genuinely dangerous. Nobles, judges, and ordinary Parisians alike have had enough of Mazarin, enough of taxes, enough of feeling as though the crown takes and gives nothing back in return. Paris, your own capital, becomes a place where a small boy king is no longer safe. The word Fronde itself comes from a child's slingshot, the little toy Parisian street kids used to fling stones at passing carriages, which tells you everything about how seriously the authorities initially took the unrest, and exactly how seriously the rebels did not take the authorities. What begins as scattered grumbling among judges over royal overreach spirals over the following years into something far more dangerous. A tangled, shifting alliance of disgruntled nobility, angry Parisian crowds, and opportunistic princes of the blood, all circling a throne occupied by a child too young to defend it, and a regent too resented to be trusted. For you, none of this is abstract political theory. This is the sound of an angry crowd growing closer outside your windows. At one particularly alarming moment, a mob forces its way into the royal palace simply to confirm with their own eyes that the young king has not been secretly spirited away somewhere safer. Imagine lying perfectly still in your bed, pretending to be lost in peaceful sleep, while total strangers file past your room to inspect you like a parcel they're not entirely sure hasn't been swapped for a fake. You keep your eyes shut. You do not move a muscle. And somewhere beneath that forced stillness, something cold and permanent begins to take root in you. Then comes the night you will never fully shake for the rest of your life. With Paris no longer safe, your household flees the city under the cover of darkness in the dead of winter. The most powerful child in Europe, hustled out of his own capital like a criminal on the run, sleeping in unfamiliar, freezing rooms, unsure which of the adults around him can truly be trusted. This is not a story told to comfort children before bed. It is a genuinely traumatic ordeal, and the sheer humiliation of it. A king forced to flee his own subjects in the middle of the night burns itself into your memory with a permanence that formal lessons never could have achieved. The rebellion drags on for years in fits and starts, an exhausting tangle of shifting loyalties where noble factions betray one another, switch sides when convenient, and generally behave like the best-dressed, most heavily armed soap opera cast in European history. Eventually, as these things often do, it collapses under the weight of its own confusion. The rebels never quite manage to agree on what, exactly, they are rebelling for, and a movement divided against itself cannot survive for long. The monarchy limps through, battered but very much intact, and eventually you return to a Paris that had, not so long before, chased you out into the cold. But you come back a different boy. You have absorbed a lesson that no tutor, however skilled, could ever have taught you from a textbook. A lesson written instead in freezing nights and jeering crowds. You have learned, in the marrow of your bones, that Paris cannot be trusted. That the nobility, given even the smallest opening, will turn on their own king like a pack of wolves scenting weakness. That a monarch who lives too closely among his own restless subjects lives forever at their mercy. And mercy, as you've just discovered firsthand, is in desperately short supply. Somewhere in the quiet corners of your young mind, an idea begins to take shape, stubborn, patient, and entirely your own. If Paris is a trap, then one day when the power is finally yours, you will build an entirely different world somewhere else. Somewhere on your own terms. Somewhere the nobility comes crawling to you, dancing attendance at your pleasure, instead of sharpening their knives in the shadowed corners of your own capital. It sounds, on the surface, like nothing more than a childhood grudge. And it is a grudge, but it is also, quietly and patiently, the earliest blueprint for the most extravagant palace the world has ever seen. For now, though, you remain a young man waiting in the wings while other, older hands hold the true reins of power. That arrangement is about to change forever. The very moment your patient, watchful cardinal finally runs out of time to teach you anything else. Let's be honest about your formal schooling, because history certainly is. It is patchy at best. Tutors drift in and out of your life. Latin is attempted with limited enthusiasm, and nobody, understandably, works you especially hard, because who exactly is going to hand the King of France a failing grade on his conjugations? What you lack in rigorous book learning, however, you more than make up for through sheer, relentless observation. You study Mazarin the way a hunting cat studies a bird, patiently, silently, missing nothing. You absorb, session after session, that information hoarded quietly is worth more than information shouted loudly. That patience, deployed correctly, is one of the sharpest weapons available to a ruler. That the person who speaks least in a room is very often the person who actually controls it. There are admittedly subjects at which you genuinely excel, and tellingly, they are the ones suited to a performer rather than a scholar. You become a magnificent dancer, drilling for hours not out of obligation but genuine passion. You ride superbly. You develop an almost instinctive command of ceremony, how to enter a room, how to hold a pose, how to dominate an entire space without uttering a single word. These are not trivial accomplishments in your world. In the France you are being shaped to rule, appearance is a genuine form of power, and you are quietly becoming a true artist of appearances. But your real education, the one that will actually matter, happens inside the council chamber, and the entire curriculum is simply Mazarin himself. You watch him manage frightened men and vain men and dangerous men, each handled with a completely different touch, each walking away feeling as though the conversation had gone exactly the way they wanted, when in fact it had gone exactly the way Mazarin wanted. You notice that he almost never reveals what he genuinely believes, that he lets other men talk themselves into corners while keeping his own cards pressed flat against his chest. Every single council session becomes, in effect, a private lesson, and you never once miss class. The most valuable thing you take from all of this watching is a lesson about control itself. You observe, quietly and carefully, how a chief minister, technically nothing more than your own servant, has come to effectively run your entire kingdom in your name. You watch real power flow through his hands instead of yours, day after day, year after year. And while you are far too clever to ever voice open resentment, you file the observation away with great care. A king who allows any single man to accumulate that much unchecked power, you begin to understand, is not truly a king at all. He is simply a very well-dressed spectator. You are also, quietly and painfully, learning to wait. This may be the single hardest lesson of your entire youth, particularly for a young man everyone around him insists on calling a living miracle. Every instinct in a proud young heart screams to seize control immediately, to prove himself at the earliest possible moment, to grab the throne's true power with both hands and never let go. But Mazarin teaches you, simply by living it in front of you day after day, that the hunter who waits patiently eats far better than the hunter who lunges too soon. So you bide your time, you smile, you watch. You wait for the single moment that will change absolutely everything. It is, when you add it all up, a strange sort of education. Thin on formal grammar, remarkably thick on strategy. Weak in the schoolroom, genuinely extraordinary in the theater of real power. You emerge from your youth not as a polished scholar, but as something considerably more dangerous to those around you. A young man who has spent his entire life quietly studying exactly how kingdoms are truly controlled, and exactly how easily that control can slip into the wrong hands if a king isn't paying close enough attention. So when the day finally arrives that your patient teacher is gone for good, everyone around you assumes you will simply seek out another Mazarin to lean on. They could not have misjudged you more completely, and the announcement you are about to make will leave your entire council speechless. Mazarin finally dies in March of 1661, and the general assumption across the French court is that you will do exactly what every king before you has done, appoint a new chief minister and return to your hunting and your dancing. Instead, at just 22 years old, you summon your stunned council, look them each in the eye, and calmly announce that from this day forward, you intend to be your own first minister. No intermediary, no powerful cardinal standing between you and your kingdom. Just you. The room falls into that very particular kind of silence that only occurs when a young man has just casually seized total, unshared control of an entire kingdom before most people have even finished their breakfast. To fully appreciate how shocking this moment truly is, you have to understand the expectation it shatters. For your entire life, and for a great deal of your father's reign before you, France has operated under the guidance of a single powerful chief minister, first Richelieu, then Mazarin. That is simply how the machinery of French government has always worked. The king reigns, symbolic and magnificent, while a brilliant and ruthless servant handles the actual grinding labor of governing. The entire court assumes this comfortable pattern will simply continue, and more than a few ambitious men are already quietly maneuvering to become the next indispensable minister. So when you stand before your assembled council and inform them, politely but with unmistakable finality, that you intend to handle that role yourself from now on, the effect is roughly equivalent to announcing that gravity has been suspended for the afternoon. They wait, understandably, for some kind of punchline. There isn't one. You tell them plainly that nothing of consequence is to be decided without your direct knowledge, that no official document is to be sealed without your personal approval, that they are to report to you directly, and to expect that you will actually read every word of what they bring you. The dancer, it turns out, fully intends to run the entire show himself. This is the precise moment where all those years of quiet, patient watching finally pay their dividend. You are not bluffing, and everyone around you quickly realizes it. You have spent your entire childhood studying exactly how power truly moves through a court, and now you seize hold of it with a confidence that genuinely stuns even your harshest critics. You throw yourself into the actual work of governing with an appetite nobody anticipated from a young man previously known mostly for his ballroom talents. You attend to the tedious daily business of the state for hours at a stretch, reading endless reports, interrogating officials over minor details, mastering a level of granular information most kings would happily delegate away without a second thought. Here is the part that eventually wins over even your fiercest skeptics. You keep it up. This is not some brief burst of youthful enthusiasm destined to fizzle out within a month once the novelty fades. It becomes the defining rhythm of your entire reign. Decade after decade, you remain seated at the very center of the machine, personally pulling every important lever, absolutely refusing to ever again allow one overpowerful minister to become the true, hidden ruler of France in your place. You watched what that arrangement did to your own childhood, and you have quietly decided, once and for all, that it will never happen to you again. You are shrewd about how you build your new government, too. You deliberately select ministers who are genuinely talented but low-born men who owe their entire status, their entire fortune, their entire existence at court to you alone, and to absolutely no one else. A grand duke from an ancient bloodline might quietly dream of one day overshadowing the crown that granted his family its titles centuries ago. A gifted commoner you personally elevated from obscurity, however, understands with perfect clarity exactly where his power originates, and exactly how quickly it could be taken away again. You surround yourself with genuine brilliance while ensuring that every last drop of it remains entirely dependent on your continued favor. It is around this exact period that the idea of you as the absolute, singular center of everything truly begins to take hold. The notion that the king is not merely a ruler presiding over his territory, but is in fact the very source of all legitimate authority, the sun around which the entire kingdom is obligated to orbit. It is, by any measure, an audacious claim to make about oneself. What makes it stick, what makes an entire nation eventually accept it as simple fact, is that you back the claim up with genuinely relentless, exhausting daily work. You do not merely announce that you deserve this kind of power. You do the job, hour after hour, for decades, in a way that makes the claim feel less like propaganda and more like simple, observable truth. But claiming to be the undisputed center of everything inevitably invites challengers. And one of your own most talented officials is about to make the catastrophic mistake of trying to shine just a little too brightly, in the presence of a king who has just decided the sun does not share its sky with anyone. Let me introduce you to Nicolas Fouquet, your superintendent of finances, a man blessed with exquisite taste and, as it turns out, absolutely catastrophic political instincts. In his eagerness to impress you, he throws a party at his private shadehouse so extravagant, so drenched in gold, so almost aggressively lavish, that you spend the entire evening smiling politely on the outside while quietly seething on the inside. The man, you realize with growing irritation, has better fountains than you do. Within a matter of weeks, you have him arrested and locked away for the remainder of his life. The lesson ripples across France with perfect, unmistakable clarity. Never, under any circumstances, throw a grander party than the Sun King. Fouquet is, to be fair to him, genuinely brilliant at his job, and that brilliance is precisely part of what makes him so dangerous. As the man responsible for managing the kingdom's finances, he has grown extraordinarily, almost eyebrow-raisingly wealthy, and he has poured a considerable portion of that fortune into building himself a shadehouse called Vaux-le-Vicomte that is, by any honest measure, an architectural masterpiece. Elegant beyond description, with magnificent formal gardens, dazzling interior decor, and every conceivable luxury money can purchase, it represents the absolute pinnacle of mid-17th century French taste. He assembles a genuine dream team of architects, painters, and garden designers to bring his vision to life. The very same gifted individuals you will, before long, quietly poach for a project of your own. In the summer of 1661, only months after you seize full personal control of your government, Fouquet decides to host a magnificent celebration in your honor at this jewel of a house. He intends it as a triumphant gesture, a glittering display of loyalty and refined taste, a genuine attempt to dazzle his young king into deeper favor. And dazzle it certainly does. There are elaborate fountains and spectacular fireworks, a lavish multi-course feast, an entirely new play commissioned and performed specifically for the occasion, and breathtaking beauty arranged at every possible turn. It is, quite possibly, the single most spectacular private party France has ever witnessed. Now imagine yourself at this celebration. You are the king. You are supposed to be, by definition, the single most magnificent presence in any room you ever choose to enter. And here you are instead, wandering politely through a subject's private residence, surrounded on every side by overwhelming proof that this particular subject lives more splendidly than you currently do. Every gorgeous fountain feels like a small, deliberate insult. Every gilded ceiling seems to whisper, quietly but unmistakably, that Fouquet's taste and Fouquet's fortune have somehow managed to outshine the crown itself. You smile pleasantly throughout the entire evening. Internally, the temperature drops considerably. Here is the uncomfortable truth of the matter. This particular outcome was likely inevitable for Fouquet regardless of whether he'd thrown any party at all. You and your rising young minister, Jean-Baptiste Colbert, have already been quietly examining the state of the royal finances for some time, and there are serious, mounting questions about precisely how Fouquet managed to accumulate quite so much personal wealth while simultaneously handling the kingdom's money. But the sheer audacity of the party removes any last flicker of hesitation you might otherwise have felt. A man this wealthy, this powerful, this comfortable flaunting it directly in your presence, is exactly the kind of overmighty subject you have privately sworn you will never again tolerate. Your revenge, true to everything Mazarin ever taught you, is patient and cold. You do not lash out at the party itself, or even in its immediate aftermath. You wait several careful weeks, arrange every detail meticulously, and then have Fouquet arrested in dramatic fashion while he is deliberately far away from his network of allies and supporters. The trial that follows drags on for an extended period and becomes a genuine public spectacle. And when the court eventually hands down a sentence you personally consider far too lenient, mere banishment from the kingdom, you take the highly unusual step of personally intervening to make the punishment considerably harsher. Fouquet is imprisoned for the remainder of his natural life. He dies behind those prison walls years later, having never again tasted freedom. The message travels across France with perfect, chilling clarity. No subject, however talented, however genuinely useful to the crown, however loyal he may consider himself in his own private estimation, is permitted to outshine the king. Ambition in your kingdom is tolerated only when it operates in direct service to the crown, never in open competition with it. Everyone who attended that glittering party, and everyone who merely heard the breathless accounts afterward, understands the new rules of your reign in an instant. The sun, as it turns out, has absolutely no intention of sharing the sky with anyone. And in a twist that is almost breathtaking in its practicality, you promptly help yourself to the very same artists, architects, and garden designers who made Fouquet's party so dangerously magnificent in the first place, gathering them together for a project of your own that will, before long, make Vaux-le-Vicomte look like a modest country cottage by comparison. With Fouquet permanently removed from the picture, you turn your attention to Jean-Baptiste Colbert, a tireless, joyless workaholic who approaches the entire French economy as though it were a personal spreadsheet that has deeply, personally offended him. He builds new factories from nothing. He expands your navy into a genuine fighting force. He hunts down financial corruption with relentless energy. He squeezes tax revenue out of every available source with the grim enthusiasm of a man who appears to have never once relaxed in his entire adult life. You come to adore him for exactly this reason, because Colbert generates the money that funds the glory that ultimately makes you look magnificent to the entire watching world. Someone, after all, has to pay for all those fountains, and it was certainly never going to be you personally. Colbert is, in many ways, the ideal minister for a king with your particular instincts and insecurities. He is not some glittering aristocrat harboring grand ambitions of his own. He is instead a grim, methodical man of relatively humble origins who rose entirely through sheer competence and an almost frightening capacity for sustained work. He owes literally everything he has to you personally, which is precisely how you prefer your ministers to be positioned. He will never once throw a party designed to rival your own splendor, because he would privately consider such an evening a scandalous waste of time that could otherwise have been spent carefully balancing the royal accounts. His great, consuming obsession is making France genuinely wealthy, and he pursues this goal with the singular intensity of a man on a lifelong personal crusade. He firmly believes the kingdom should produce everything it possibly needs domestically, while simultaneously selling as much as possible abroad to foreign markets, hoarding national wealth the way a dragon in an old story hoards its treasure. To that end, he founds and generously supports new industries, actively encourages skilled craftsmen to relocate and train apprentices, builds up domestic manufacturing capacity from almost nothing, and works tirelessly to make French luxury goods the envy of every court in Europe. If a foreign buyer somewhere is purchasing a particular good, Colbert wants that good manufactured on French soil instead. He also builds you a genuine navy, essentially from scratch, transforming France into a serious maritime and colonial power almost overnight. He improves the kingdom's roads and canal networks so that goods can move efficiently from one region to another. He reforms the deeply tangled mess of royal finances, methodically hunting down the corruption and waste that men like Fouquet had feasted on for years without consequence. He is, in every meaningful sense, the engine room of your entire reign, laboring away tirelessly below deck, so that you can stand gleaming magnificently on the top deck, endlessly admired by everyone who looks your way. It is, on paper, a genuinely fine arrangement, particularly if you happen to be the one standing on the top deck enjoying the view. The trouble, and there is always some trouble lurking nearby, is that your accumulated glory turns out to be monstrously, almost comically expensive. The wars you love waging, the palace you are quietly beginning to build, the endless, glittering spectacle of your royal court, all of it devours money at a genuinely terrifying rate. Colbert spends his entire career desperately trying to refill a treasury that you are simultaneously, cheerfully emptying out from the other end. Picture a man frantically bailing water out of a small sinking boat, while the ship's captain happily drills additional holes in the hull simply to enjoy an improved view of the passing scenery. That, in essence, is Colbert's entire professional existence in miniature. And here we should pause and be entirely honest about where all of that money ultimately originates, because it is not a particularly comfortable answer to sit with. The great burden of taxation falls hardest, disproportionately and unfairly, on those least equipped to bear it, the peasants and ordinary working people scattered across the French countryside. Meanwhile, many of the wealthiest and most privileged members of society remain entirely exempt by long-standing tradition. Colbert is clever, and he squeezes administrative efficiency out of the system wherever he possibly can. But there is only so much even a brilliant finance minister can accomplish when the underlying system itself has been deliberately built to spare the rich while grinding down the poor. Colbert serves you faithfully for decades, working himself to the point of genuine exhaustion entirely in your name, and yet he never quite manages to win the endless uphill race against your personal spending habits. He warns you, as gently as a man in his precarious position dares to warn a king, that the wars and the relentless extravagance cannot possibly be sustained indefinitely. You do not, understandably, particularly want to hear this warning. The sun, after all, has fountains that need running and battles that need fighting, and the tedious business of accounting is, frankly, somebody else's headache to manage. Still, all of that accumulated wealth and all of that ceaseless effort served a purpose that extended well beyond mere survival. It became fuel for an image, a carefully, deliberately crafted legend of a king so radiant that the entire watching world found itself simply unable to look away. And it is time now that we discussed exactly how you became, quite literally, the sun itself. Here is precisely where you earn your famous nickname. You genuinely love ballet, and you happen to be rather exceptional at it. So you dance in elaborate court productions, wrapped in costumes absolutely dripping with gold thread. In one particularly memorable performance, you appear as Apollo, the classical god of the sun, radiating light across the stage while the entire assembled court applauds as though their lives depend on the enthusiasm of their response, which, in a very real sense, they sort of do. From that single performance onward, the image sticks permanently. You are the sun, France is your sky, and everyone else in the kingdom is expected to orbit quietly and obediently around you. You are not merely a casual dabbler in dance, either. You are seriously, deeply dedicated to the craft, drilling for hours at a stretch with genuine professional intensity, because you understand something that a great many other rulers of your era completely miss. In your world, performance itself is a form of politics. When the king appears before his assembled court in a spectacular ballet, radiant and graceful, and utterly in command of every movement, he is not simply entertaining his audience. He is actively demonstrating power, discipline, and beauty all in a single unified gesture. Every carefully executed leap becomes a small, deliberate act of statecraft, performed in remarkably tight, remarkably sparkling costumes. The role of Apollo, the sun god, becomes the one that comes to define your entire public image. Draped head to toe in gold, crowned with golden rays of light, you embody the sun itself, the source of all warmth, all life, the single fixed point around which everything else in the universe is obligated to turn. It is not remotely subtle, and it was never intended to be subtle. You are announcing, through the unlikely medium of interpretive court dance, that you consider yourself the literal center of the universe. And because you are the king, everyone seated in that audience nods along politely, as though this were a perfectly reasonable claim for a young man in tights to make about himself. The genius of this particular sun imagery lies in the fact that it operates on multiple levels simultaneously. The sun is glorious and beautiful, certainly, but it is also essential and fundamentally unchallengeable. You cannot argue with the sun. You cannot vote it out of office or negotiate more favorable terms with it. It simply reigns high above everything else, generously giving light to those it favors while leaving everyone else in shadow. By deliberately making yourself the sun, you transform your authority into something that feels considerably less like ordinary politics and considerably more like the fundamental, unquestionable order of the cosmos itself. This carefully cultivated image spreads rapidly far beyond the dance floor. It becomes the defining theme of your entire reign, stamped permanently onto your palace architecture, your commissioned artwork, your elaborate gardens, and your ongoing royal propaganda. Sun motifs appear absolutely everywhere you look, radiant golden faces and sweeping rays worked deliberately into every possible decoration, until the entire world surrounding your court seems to glow continuously with this single unifying idea. Artists and writers, many of them quite handsomely paid for their efforts, tirelessly reinforce the message that you are a being of almost genuinely divine radiance. It is, in essence, the 17th century equivalent of the most relentless, most thoroughly executed personal branding campaign imaginable. And remarkably, it works. People genuinely come to perceive you in exactly these terms, partly because you never once stop performing this particular role, whether on an actual stage or simply moving through your daily life. Every formal ceremony, every public appearance, every carefully staged moment of your day is meticulously choreographed to project this same unified idea of dazzling, seemingly effortless supremacy. You do not merely tell people that you are the Sun King. You make them genuinely feel it, in the theater and in the throne room alike, until the line separating the performance from the man himself blurs almost completely away. There is a shrewd, calculated logic underlying all of this glittering spectacle. A monarch who is merely feared can, in time, be resented and eventually resisted by his subjects. A monarch who is genuinely admired, even quietly adored, who appears to belong to some higher order of being entirely, becomes far more difficult to challenge in any meaningful way. Your enemies cannot simply hate a political rival in the ordinary sense. They must somehow find a way to argue against the sun itself. And that, as you understand perfectly well, is fundamentally a losing position from which to argue anything. The dancing, as it turns out, was never merely dancing at all. But an image this genuinely grand requires a physical stage grand enough to properly contain it, and the ordinary, aging royal palaces scattered across France are nowhere near magnificent enough to house a living sun. And so you decide to build an entirely new one, out on a swampy, mosquito-infested patch of hunting ground your father once used for recreation. The result will leave the entire watching world absolutely astonished. Remember that cold, humiliating seed planted so many years earlier, during your childhood flight from a rebellious Paris. It finally blossoms into Versailles. You take your father's modest, unremarkable hunting lodge and over the course of decades, transform it into the single most extravagant palace the world has ever seen built, almost unbelievably, on what is essentially a disease-ridden marsh. Thousands upon thousands of laborers toil for years, draining the swampland, digging endless foundations, hauling in materials from distant regions, and a genuinely grim number of them die in the process, claimed by fever, accidents, and sheer physical exhaustion. You spend a fortune so vast it makes your own treasurer weep openly. But in the end, you get precisely what you set out to build, a golden kingdom entirely your own, positioned safely far away from the ungrateful, unpredictable crowds of Paris. The choice of location tells you everything you need to know about the man you have become by this point in your reign. Versailles is not selected because it is convenient or comfortable or in any way practical. It is chosen, at least in part, precisely because it belongs entirely to you, unburdened by any association with a rebellious capital city, a genuinely blank canvas situated safely away from the very city that once chased you out into the freezing winter darkness as a frightened child. If the capital itself cannot ever be fully trusted again, then you will simply construct an entirely new center of the world somewhere the angry crowds cannot possibly reach you. And you will make everyone else come to you instead, on your own terms. The land itself, it must be said, is genuinely dreadful for this particular purpose. It is low-lying, perpetually damp and thoroughly swampy, precisely the kind of ground that breeds fever and quietly swallows foundations whole. Transforming this unpromising terrain into an earthly paradise requires an almost unimaginable, sustained effort. Vast armies of laborers work for years draining the surrounding marshes, moving positively colossal amounts of earth by hand, and hauling in fresh water from considerable distances simply to feed the elaborate fountains and gardens you have demanded. It amounts, in a very real sense, to a sustained war waged directly against the natural landscape itself, fought with nothing more than shovels, wagons, and sheer human stubbornness. And the landscape, unsurprisingly, does not surrender its ground cheaply or easily. The human cost involved in all of this is real and considerable, and it deserves to be named honestly rather than quietly glossed over in service of the palace's later beauty. Working conditions on the site are genuinely brutal. Many laborers fall seriously ill in the damp, unhealthy air surrounding the construction site. Accidents on a construction project of this staggering scale are disturbingly common. A significant number of workers ultimately die in the process of building your dream palace, their considerable suffering quietly buried forever beneath the marble floors and gilded ceilings that visitors will later admire without ever knowing the true cost of their creation. The palace glitters magnificently in the sunlight, but its very foundations were laid down by ordinary people who paid an extraordinarily steep price to make that glittering possible. And then, of course, there is the money. Versailles devours royal funds on a scale that genuinely horrifies careful, methodical men like Colbert, who can see with perfect clarity exactly what this kind of relentless spending is doing to a treasury he is desperately trying to keep adequately full. But you are simply not to be dissuaded from your vision. You bring in the finest artistic and architectural talents available anywhere in France, including the very same designers and gardeners who made Fouquet's Chateau so dangerously, so memorably beautiful in the first place. And you set them all to work creating something that will make that earlier masterpiece look, by comparison, like a modest garden shed. The finished result, once it fully takes shape over the following decades, is genuinely staggering to behold. Endless gilded halls stretch in every direction. Ceilings are painted with elaborate scenes depicting your own personal glory. Formal gardens extend outward toward the horizon in perfect, almost mathematical geometric order. Fountains and statues and countless mirrors appear at every conceivable turn. It is not merely a house, however grand. It is a deliberate statement, a carefully engineered machine designed specifically for projecting royal power, a physical embodiment made solid in marble and gold of the sun image you have worked so tirelessly to cultivate throughout your reign. Everyone who walks through its endless corridors is meant to feel small, thoroughly dazzled, and utterly, completely convinced of your greatness. But Versailles turns out to be considerably more than a mere showpiece for visiting dignitaries, and this is the genuinely clever part of your overall design. It becomes, in practice, a gilded trap disguised as an earthly paradise. You will draw the great, powerful, noble families of France into this golden world of your own creation, keeping them close where you can personally watch their every move. Instead of brooding alone on their distant country estates and quietly plotting rebellion against the crown, as their ancestors once did with alarming regularity, they will instead spend their days and nights squabbling endlessly over the tremendous honor of simply being permitted to attend you. The palace that appears, on its surface, to be nothing more than pure indulgence is, underneath all that gold leaf, actually a remarkably effective instrument of political control. Because life inside Versailles is about to become one of the strangest arrangements imaginable, a place where even the simplest, most private, ordinary human activities are systematically transformed into elaborate public ceremonies, performed daily before a captive audience. And it all begins the very moment you open your eyes each morning. Your mornings, it must be understood, are simply not your own, not even slightly. Every single day begins with what the court calls the lever, the elaborate ceremonial waking of the king, and it is performed in its entirety in front of a carefully assembled crowd. The most important nobles in all of France actively compete with one another for the tremendous honor of simply watching you open your eyes, of handing you a towel, or of quietly observing you sitting upright in bed for the very first time each day. Imagine, if you can, your morning alarm sounding while 40 people dressed in elaborate wigs stand nearby, genuinely thrilled beyond measure simply to witness you becoming conscious. There is, quite literally, no snooze button available anywhere within the walls of Versailles. Let's walk through this peculiar ritual properly, because the sheer strangeness of it genuinely deserves careful attention. As you begin to stir awake within your enormous, elaborately carved bed, the chamber doors swing open and the entire ceremony begins in carefully ranked, sequential stages. First, only the most privileged handful of courtiers are admitted into your presence. Then, gradually, more arrive. Then still more after that. Wave after wave of eager courtiers file in, one carefully ranked group at a time, each hopping to witness the genuine miracle of their king becoming vertical for another day. Each individual stage of this staged admission process functions as a clear mark of relative status. and ambitious men will scheme for months on end simply to secure a place among an earlier, more exclusive wave of admission. The specific tasks involved in this daily ritual are almost absurdly petty, and yet they are treated with absolute, unwavering seriousness by everyone involved. One particular nobleman might hold the genuinely coveted privilege of personally handing you your morning shirt. Another might be granted the honor of holding the ceremonial washing basin while you rinse your hands. Yet another might simply pass you a towel when needed. These small, seemingly trivial tasks are not regarded as mundane chores in the slightest. They are treated as genuine honors, fought over fiercely, envied bitterly by those excluded, and remembered for years afterward by those fortunate enough to receive them. A duke would genuinely consider it a personal triumph to be the man permitted to hold your ceremonial candlestick during this ritual, which tells you virtually everything you need to know about the peculiar world you have carefully constructed around yourself. To you, naturally, none of this elaborate morning theater is merely empty ceremony for its own sake. It is, in fact, a finely tuned instrument of political power. By deliberately transforming your ordinary morning routine into an elaborate public performance, you succeed in keeping the greatest, most potentially dangerous men in your entire kingdom hovering anxiously around your bed each morning like nervous pigeons, desperately watching for even the smallest sign of your personal favor. A man who spends his mental energy obsessing over whether he will be permitted to hand you a simple towel is, by definition, a man with considerably less time and energy remaining to raise an army against you. It is political control cleverly disguised as harmless ceremony, and it works absolutely beautifully. There is, admittedly, a strange and genuinely suffocating cost to all of this elaborate theater, and that cost falls entirely upon you personally. You are never, under any circumstances, truly alone. That groggy, deeply private, universally human moment when a person first wakes and is simply themselves before the demands of the day fully begin, that moment simply does not exist for you, has perhaps never existed for you. There is no rolling over for 5 additional quiet minutes. No lying still in comfortable silence. From your very first breath of each new day, you are already on public display, performing the demanding role of king for an audience that studies your every small gesture with genuine, unrelenting intensity. Picture the full sensory reality of this daily experience. The shuffling sound of dozens of feet moving across polished marble floors, the rustle of heavy silk garments, the low, competitive murmur of hushed courtier voices, the faint, mingled scent of powder and perfume rising from a crowd that has bathed rather sparingly and compensated rather heavily for the deficiency. And there you are, positioned at the exact center of it all, somehow expected to appear serene and genuinely magnificent while barely fully awake, because the sun, as everyone understands implicitly, is simply not permitted to look bleary-eyed or grumpy before he has even finished his morning chocolate. The entire elaborate spectacle repeats itself again each evening in reverse, during what the court calls the coucher, when the assembled crowd gathers once more to formally watch you retire to bed for the night. Your entire day, from its very first moment to its very last, is bookended by attentive audiences. You exist, in the most literal possible sense, as a performer who genuinely never leaves the stage, whose single greatest ongoing role is simply existing visibly and gloriously in front of the very people you are quietly, deliberately keeping on a very short leash. It is, when considered honestly, genuinely exhausting. It is also, at the same time, remarkably ingenious as a system of political control. And it is, above all else, completely and utterly mad by any ordinary human standard. And if you find it strange that dozens of grown adults gather each morning simply to watch you wake up, then brace yourself for learning precisely how many additional people become involved in the deeply complicated, status-obsessed ordeal of getting you into a single shirt each day. Since you are quite obviously unable to wake up in any genuine privacy, you are, by the exact same logic, equally unable to get dressed in private either. The simple, ordinary act of putting on your morning shirt transforms itself into an elaborate, rank-governed relay race, where the tremendous privilege of physically handing you a single garment is fought over with the same intensity most people reserve for a significant career promotion. Whoever happens to be the highest-ranking individual present in the room at that particular moment receives the honor, and if someone of even greater rank happens to walk in while the shirt is still mid-transfer, the garment is promptly passed along to the newcomer instead. You stand there, half-dressed and faintly chilly, while grown aristocrats treat your morning underwear as though it were the single most significant political event of the entire day. The specific rules governing this daily ritual are dizzyingly, almost comically precise. There exists an exact, carefully documented order determining who may touch which particular garment, who is permitted to formally present which specific item, and who must simply stand aside and watch with quiet, simmering envy at having been passed over entirely. Handing you your shirt personally is considered one of the truly great prizes available at court, reserved exclusively for the most exalted individuals present. Lesser courtiers must content themselves with correspondingly lesser roles, perhaps assisting with a single stocking, or simply holding your dressing robe steady. Each individual task is ranked with a level of obsessive specificity that would genuinely make a military drill sergeant weep with professional admiration. The truly comic element of this entire arrangement emerges whenever the established pecking order suddenly shifts partway through the dressing process. Suppose, for instance, that a nobleman of relatively high but not quite supreme rank has just been honored with the privilege of handing you your shirt. If someone of genuinely greater rank happens to arrive while that same shirt is still technically in transit toward your body, established protocol demands that the garment immediately be handed off to this grander newcomer, who then formally presents it to you himself. Your simple morning shirt can, in principle, change hands multiple times before it ever actually reaches your body. You could plausibly develop a mild chill while waiting for the 17th century equivalent of a lengthy corporate approval chain to finally clear itself. For you personally, standing there being dressed like an extraordinarily expensive ceremonial doll, none of this feels remotely humiliating. It is, in fact, precisely the entire point of the exercise. Every single nobleman jostling desperately for the right to touch your clothing is, by definition, a nobleman utterly absorbed in the anxious pursuit of royal favor. Their entire private world has effectively shrunk down to the size of your personal wardrobe. They measure their own importance, their very sense of self-worth, by whether or not they are permitted to hold a single sleeve. And while they remain thoroughly preoccupied with this pursuit, they are, quite conveniently, most certainly not plotting rebellion against your throne. You have, in effect, successfully weaponized fashion itself as a tool of political control. The gossip and underlying tension surrounding these particular ceremonial roles runs genuinely deep throughout the court. Being granted a brand new privilege during the dressing ceremony, or conversely losing an existing one, sends visible shockwaves rippling through the entire assembled court. Noble families track these small honors with genuinely obsessive attention. A single promotion within the dressing ceremony hierarchy can meaningfully raise an entire family's social standing, while a perceived snub can wound that same family's reputation for years afterward. People arrange enormous portions of their lives, their marriages, their political alliances, their personal debts, entirely around the desperate hope of moving one small rung closer to your linen closet. It is, in every meaningful sense, madness, but madness organized according to a remarkably strict and carefully maintained seating chart. Meanwhile, spare an occasional thought for your own actual physical comfort during all of this, since virtually nobody else at court seems particularly inclined to do so. Getting dressed each morning should reasonably take only a few uneventful minutes. For you, however, It becomes a slow, elaborate, carefully choreographed ballet performed entirely by other people upon your own person, conducted in a crowded room full of attentive watchers, entirely at the mercy of rigid protocols that care absolutely nothing about whether you happen to be warm, comfortable, or simply in something of a hurry that particular morning. The single most powerful man in all of Europe cannot, apparently, simply pull on his own shirt unassisted and get on with his day like an ordinary person. Absolute power, as it turns out through daily lived experience, comes bundled together with absolutely no meaningful personal privacy whatsoever. And yet you designed this entire elaborate system yourself, quite deliberately, down to every single ludicrous individual rule embedded within it. Because the genuine alternative, an idle, ambitious court of noblemen with far too much unstructured free time and long-simmering grudges, is considerably more dangerous to your throne than a slightly chilly morning spent waiting for your shirt to complete its ceremonial journey across the room. All of this obsessive daily ceremony reaches its natural peak, somewhat unsurprisingly, around the most basic and universal of all human activities. Because at Versailles, even the simple, ordinary act of eating a meal is deliberately transformed into a grand public performance, with you positioned firmly as the star attraction. It is time to eat, and yes, as always, people are watching closely. Your grand formal meals function as genuinely semi-public events, with courtiers and even curious visiting members of the public, occasionally permitted to observe the king working his way steadily through an elaborate meal. You proceed through course after course, while an attentive audience studies your every single bite as though it were carrying some deep religious significance. There exists a strange, particular dignity required in eating an ordinary bowl of soup gracefully before a completely silent crowd of onlookers. You have thoroughly mastered this peculiar skill over the years. You have had to. Nobody ever properly warned you, growing up, that becoming a living god would mean never once being permitted to simply eat a meal alone. The sheer scale of your formal dining arrangements is genuinely astonishing to behold. The grand public meal, known formally as the grand couvert, is an extraordinarily lavish affair, involving a small army of dedicated servants carrying elaborate dishes through the palace in a carefully choreographed procession, with each individual course delivered with a level of formal ceremony that would honestly be more appropriate for an actual coronation. The food itself travels considerable distances from distant palace kitchens, carried through long corridors by an extended chain of attendants, meaning that by the time much of it actually reaches your table, it has typically cooled down considerably. You dine, in every meaningful sense, like a living god, and yet you quite often find yourself dining on distinctly lukewarm godly food. Your personal appetite, it must be honestly noted, is the stuff of genuine legend among contemporary observers. Visitors marveled openly at the sheer quantity of food you were reliably capable of consuming, working steadily through course after course, dish after dish, in a sustained display that was almost as genuinely impressive as it was faintly alarming to witness firsthand. You eat with the complete, unshakable confidence of a man who has quite literally never once had to wonder where his next meal might be coming from, working methodically through soups, various meats, fowl, fish, and elaborate sweets, all while your assembled audience watches on in respectful, faintly astonished silence. It amounts, in its own peculiar way, to a genuine performance of pure material abundance itself. And a genuine audience there certainly is. People travel specifically to watch you eat, in roughly the same way modern audiences might attend a scheduled theatrical performance. Under certain specific conditions, respectable visitors to the palace could file quietly through the dining hall simply to observe you at your meal, gazing upon the rather unusual spectacle of royal mastication in progress. Try to imagine attempting to genuinely enjoy your own dinner, while a slow, steady procession of curious sightseers shuffles past your table, murmuring quietly to one another and occasionally pointing, thoroughly thrilled simply to have personally witnessed the sun consuming his evening portion of roasted poultry. You are, quite literally, functioning simultaneously as the main course and the evening's entertainment. This particular arrangement requires a very specific, carefully cultivated skill that no ordinary person would ever need to develop under normal circumstances. You must eat with absolutely flawless grace at all times, never fumbling a single utensil, never once appearing visibly greedy despite consuming genuinely vast quantities of food, never betraying even briefly the ordinary human indignities that accompany simply having a meal. Every single movement you make is watched carefully and remembered afterward. A single clumsy moment at the dinner table would ripple steadily through court gossip for weeks afterward. And so you have deliberately transformed the basic act of eating into a genuine art form, calm, majestic, and constituting an ongoing masterclass in performing an entirely mundane human activity with remarkable, sustained beauty. The elaborate etiquette surrounding these formal meals is, predictably, its own labyrinthine system. Who exactly may attend? Who is permitted to stand where within the room? Who receives the particular honor of serving which specific dish? Who is granted the privilege of remaining seated in your immediate presence? All of it governed by precisely the same obsessive ranking system that structures every other aspect of your court's daily life. Even your dinner, in the end, functions as a carefully calibrated machine for distributing social status. Yet another stage upon which the assembled nobility performs its endless, intricate dance of precedence around the fixed, radiant point of your presence. Underneath all of this genuine splendor, however, lies that same quiet loneliness that shadows your entire existence at Versailles. The simple, comforting pleasure of an ordinary private meal, of eating unwatched, surrounded by people who are not actively studying you for the smallest possible signs of royal favor, remains a small, ordinary joy permanently denied to you. You are never truly off duty. Not even with a simple spoon resting in your hand. The most magnificent formal dining arrangements anywhere in Europe come bundled together with an audience you can never fully dismiss, and a genuine solitude you can never quite manage to escape, no matter how hard you might privately wish for it. Let's step now into the Hall of Mirrors, quite possibly the single most audacious room in your entire glittering palace, a corridor constructed for one purpose above all others, to overwhelm the senses of anyone who dares walk through it. It is lined, from one end to the other, with literally hundreds of individual mirrors, at a time in European history when mirrors themselves are staggeringly, almost absurdly expensive, and when the closely guarded secret of manufacturing them properly belongs almost exclusively to the glassmakers of Venice. So, naturally, being who you are, you commission enough mirrors to construct an entire glittering corridor of reflected light, purely to demonstrate to the watching world that you can. To fully grasp the sheer audacity of this decision, you have to understand precisely what mirrors represent in your particular century. A good, high-quality mirror is a rare and genuinely costly luxury item, the kind of single object a wealthy household might possess in one modest piece and treasure carefully for generations. The specialized art of manufacturing them is dominated almost entirely by Venetian craftsmen, who guard their manufacturing techniques so fiercely and so jealously that revealing the underlying secrets is treated, quite seriously, as an act of genuine betrayal against the state. A mirror in your era is simply not mere decoration. It is a small fortune, quite literally hung directly on a wall, and you decide with characteristic ambition to build an entire hall composed of nothing but them. The finished result is a vast, sweeping gallery running the entire length of the palace's garden-facing front, with one wall lined entirely by tall windows and the opposite wall lined with enormous mirrors, carefully positioned to catch and endlessly multiply every available ray of natural light pouring in from outside. During daylight hours, sunlight floods the space and bounces endlessly back and forth between glass and mirror, until the entire hall seems to genuinely glow from somewhere deep within itself. At night, the light from countless candles is caught in exactly the same way and thrown back 1,000-fold, transforming the long corridor into something resembling a slow-moving river of fire. It amounts, in the end, to beauty deliberately deployed as a genuine political weapon. The underlying purpose here is pure, calculated intimidation, carefully dressed up in the language of splendor. When a foreign ambassador arrives at Versailles to formally negotiate with the King of France, he is very often marched down the entire considerable length of this dazzling hall before he ever actually reaches your presence. By the time he finally arrives at the far end, blinking in the reflected brilliance, he has already been thoroughly softened up psychologically, made to viscerally feel the overwhelming wealth and unshakable confidence of the very man he has traveled so far to negotiate with. It becomes considerably more difficult to drive a genuinely hard diplomatic bargain once you have just personally walked through a physical embodiment of your host's seemingly bottomless power. There is also a clever thread of national pride carefully woven into the entire project. Rather than simply purchasing all of these hundreds of mirrors directly from Venice and thereby enriching a foreign rival, your ministers work diligently to establish a genuine mirror-making industry within France itself, as part of that broader Colbert-driven ambition to produce every conceivable luxury item domestically. The Hall of Mirrors therefore functions not merely as a monument to your own considerable ego, but simultaneously as a proud showcase of emerging French industrial capability. A bold public claim that your kingdom can now genuinely rival even the famously skilled craftsmen of Venice at their own specialized trade. Vanity and deliberate economic policy, glittering along together side by side. The hall quickly becomes the beating ceremonial heart of your entire palace's public life, the chosen setting for your grandest official occasions, formal receptions, and the significant celebratory moments when you most wish to thoroughly overwhelm your assembled guests. Standing at its center, surrounded on every side by endlessly reflected light and endlessly reflected images of your own magnificence, you become, quite literally, the sun made physically manifest, radiant at the very center of a corridor that seems to contain no shadows whatsoever. And that, in the end, represents the true underlying genius of this remarkable room. It does not merely display accumulated wealth for its own sake. It displays a carefully constructed idea. The idea of you as a being composed entirely of light, endlessly multiplied across every available surface, genuinely inescapable, filling every reflective panel until any visitor finds it simply impossible to look anywhere at all without seeing your personal glory thrown directly back at them from a dozen different angles simultaneously. It is propaganda you can physically walk through, a complete philosophy of absolute rule rendered permanently in glass and gold, and it works exactly as intended on virtually everyone who ever passes through its doors. For all of this genuine radiant splendor, though, the actual daily reality of life inside your dazzling palace turns out to be, in certain very human and very unglamorous respects, considerably less impressive than the paintings would ever suggest. And it is finally time we gently address the rather delicate matter of personal cleanliness at your court. Bathing itself is regarded with genuine medical suspicion throughout your era, since a great many physicians of the time sincerely believe that submerging oneself in water opens the body's pores and thereby actively invites disease directly inside. So instead of regularly soaking in water, your court instead leans heavily on frequent changes of fresh linen, generous applications of powder, and truly heroic quantities of perfume, all working together to mask whatever nature happens to be doing underneath one's elaborate clothing. You do, in fact, maintain private bathing rooms of your own, so the popular legend claiming you personally never washed at all is something of an exaggeration. Still, it must be said that a warm summer afternoon at your court is, to put it delicately, a genuinely memorable olfactory experience. The prevailing medical thinking of your particular age lies at the very root of this widespread avoidance of water. A great many physicians genuinely and sincerely believe that hot water physically opens the pores of human skin, and thereby leaves the entire body dangerously vulnerable to disease, which itself is widely believed at the time to travel primarily through corrupted, unhealthy air. By this particular logic, a good, thorough soak is not remotely refreshing, but is instead considered positively dangerous, essentially an open invitation for serious illness to creep directly inside the body. Basic cleanliness, at least as we understand the concept today, is genuinely regarded with real medical fear throughout your court. It is, in a sense, roughly comparable to being sincerely told that showering regularly might personally give you the plague, and adjusting your entire daily routine accordingly for the rest of your life. So your court instead develops an entirely different working notion of what it actually means to be properly clean, one centered almost entirely on fresh linen rather than on actual water. The key item in this system is the humble shirt. A fresh, clean white linen shirt worn directly against bare skin is widely believed to effectively absorb the body's various impurities and carry them safely away from the body over the course of a day. So changing one's linen shirt frequently throughout the day is considered the proper, medically sound way to remain genuinely clean. A person of genuine status might reasonably change shirts several separate times over the course of a single day, and the crisp whiteness and general freshness of one's linen becomes, in itself, a widely recognized mark of true personal refinement. You wash your actual clothing in practice far more frequently and thoroughly than you wash your own body. Then naturally comes the perfume, and here your court genuinely does not hold back in the slightest. Fragrance is layered on with tremendous, sustained enthusiasm, applied liberally to bodies, to clothing, to gloves, to elaborate wigs, and even to entire rooms alike, all in a determined and coordinated effort to mask the entirely honest, natural smells of a great many human bodies that are simply not being regularly scrubbed with soap and water in the modern sense. Your court becomes genuinely famous throughout Europe for being heavily perfumed, thoroughly drenched in floral and musky scents, a dense, lingering cloud of fragrance specifically meant to overpower whatever happens to be lying beneath it. It becomes, in practice, considerably less about actually smelling clean in any modern sense, and considerably more about smelling like something entirely different from a large, warm, closely packed crowd of human beings. Now, in genuine fairness to you personally, the popular modern image of a king who supposedly never bathed at all throughout his entire life is something of an exaggeration built up over subsequent centuries. You do maintain your own private bathing arrangements, and you are certainly not the entirely filthy figure of later legend and popular myth. But full immersion in water remains, for you, an occasional, almost purely medicinal event rather than any kind of regular daily routine, and it is hedged about carefully with considerable medical caution whenever it does occur. For the most part, you and your assembled court manage to keep clean in the fashionable manner of your era, through fresh shirts, a kind of dry cleaning, and that ever-present cloud of heavy perfume, rather than through any regular use of soap and water in the way we would recognize today. The physical setting itself makes the entire situation rather considerably worse in practice. Versailles is perpetually packed with people, sometimes numbering well into the thousands at any given time, all crowded together into a palace that, for all its considerable marble and gold, was genuinely never designed from the outset to comfortably house and accommodate such enormous multitudes of people simultaneously. On a particularly hot summer day, with direct sunlight beating down relentlessly, and the heavy perfume competing valiantly but not always successfully against the accumulated crowd, the actual atmosphere inside those glittering formal halls is a great deal richer, in every practical sense, than the surviving paintings would ever lead you to reasonably expect. It stands as one of history's genuinely great ironies, the single most magnificent palace ever constructed by human hands, the dazzling ceremonial center of European civilization, home to the legendary Sun King himself, was also, quite simultaneously, a place where the accumulated air could occasionally knock an unprepared visitor flat. Beauty for the eyes, adventure for the nose, existing side by side in the very same gilded rooms. It is one of history's great ironies indeed. The court itself, over time, simply grows thoroughly accustomed to the situation, as people generally do, with everyone's collective nose long since having surrendered to the sheer inevitability of the arrangement. If the interior of your palace could occasionally prove overwhelming to the nose, it was, by sharp contrast, an absolute and unqualified enchantment to the eye the very moment you stepped outside into your carefully designed gardens. Though even those world-famous fountains, it turns out, conceal a surprisingly desperate and rather embarrassing secret involving a chronic, ongoing shortage of usable water. Your formal gardens, designed by the brilliant landscape architect André Lenader, stretch outward toward the horizon in perfectly balanced geometric splendor, studded throughout with elaborate fountains capable of gushing dramatically to life entirely on command. Except there is, in practice, a persistent catch to this arrangement. Versailles never actually possesses enough available water pressure to run every single fountain simultaneously at full flow. So your genuinely clever palace attendants develop an ingenious workaround, an elaborate system of coordinated whistles, used to switch individual fountains on mere moments before you happen to approach them on your daily walk, and to shut them promptly off again the very instant you have safely passed by. You stroll leisurely through what appears to be an entire paradise of continuously dancing water, which is, in truth, quite literally performing its display exclusively and specifically for you alone. The gardens themselves represent a genuine artistic triumph, and Lenader's design sensibility is their true underlying genius. He imposes an almost perfect, mathematically precise order upon the natural landscape, laying out vast ceremonial avenues, precisely measured geometric flower beds, carefully sculpted ornamental hedges, and grand sweeping vistas that deliberately draw the eye steadily toward the distant horizon. Everything within the design is perfectly symmetrical, tightly controlled, and genuinely immense in overall scale. It amounts to a complete landscape bent entirely to human will and careful design. Walking slowly through these gardens is meant to feel, quite deliberately, like walking directly through the very concept of order itself, through the underlying idea of a natural world thoroughly tamed and mastered by a single guiding hand, which is to say, of course, your own hand specifically. The fountains themselves represent the true crowning glory of the entire garden design. Hundreds of individual fountains spray carefully choreographed patterns of water among the surrounding statues and reflecting pools. In an age existing many generations before the invention of electric water pumps, making water leap and dance so dramatically on such an enormous scale represents a genuinely extraordinary feat of practical hydraulic engineering. Vast, ambitious waterworks projects are constructed specifically to feed these fountains. Enormous, sustained engineering efforts designed to gather and carefully channel sufficient water toward your perpetually thirsty garden paradise. It stands as one of the most genuinely ambitious hydraulic engineering undertakings of the entire era, all directed in service of creating pretty, temporary patterns of water for a king's casual afternoon stroll. But here, at last, is the rather awkward underlying truth of the entire arrangement. For all of that considerable engineering effort, Versailles simply cannot, under any circumstances, supply sufficient water to run every single garden fountain at full flow simultaneously. The overall demand placed on the system is genuinely monstrous, and the available water supply remains stubbornly, persistently finite regardless of engineering ambition. The fountains, if all switched on together at once, would completely drain the entire system dry within a remarkably short period of time. It amounts, in essence, to the 17th century equivalent of building the most spectacular home entertainment system imaginable, only to subsequently discover that you simply cannot afford to keep every single light illuminated simultaneously. Enter, then, the genuinely ingenious and admittedly somewhat ridiculous practical solution devised by your attendants. Whenever you set out on one of your regular garden walks, attendants are strategically stationed at intervals throughout the extensive grounds, carefully watching for your steady approach and actively communicating with one another as you draw progressively closer to each individual fountain. As you near a particular fountain along your route, a coordinated signal is given, very often a simple whistle, and that specific fountain immediately roars dramatically to life, timed perfectly for you to admire it in its full glory. The very moment you have passed by and moved further along, it is then quietly shut off again, carefully conserving the precious available water supply for the very next fountain positioned further along your intended route. The overall effect, from your own personal perspective, is one of completely seamless, unbroken enchantment. Everywhere you personally choose to walk throughout the gardens, the fountains appear magnificently active and continuously flowing, gushing and sparkling precisely at the exact moment of your arrival to admire them properly. As far as you yourself can reasonably tell while strolling contentedly through your own gardens, the entire surrounding paradise appears genuinely alive with continuously dancing water at every single turn you take. You are, in a very literal and quite amusing sense, perpetually followed everywhere by an advancing wave of freshly activated fountains, while simultaneously trailed behind by an equally steady wake of newly deactivated ones, functioning, in effect, as a kind of one-man rolling water show performed exclusively for your own private benefit. There's something almost perfectly symbolic embedded within this entire arrangement. This recurring idea of an entire world that springs instantly to glorious life, the very moment the sun happens to turn its attention directly upon it, only to quietly subside again the moment the sun's attention moves elsewhere. Whether you yourself ever fully appreciated the frantic whistling and coordinated scrambling required behind the scenes to produce this seamless illusion remains, admittedly, an open question. To you personally, it was simply experienced as a beautiful garden that dutifully performed for its king, which was, after all, precisely and exactly what everything at Versailles had been so carefully designed to do from the very beginning. Of course, a paradise constructed on this truly grand a scale was always meant, at least in principle, to be shared with a queen, and it is now high time that we turned our careful attention to the patient, largely overlooked woman who formerly wore that particular crown, all while her own husband's wandering eye drifted rather freely elsewhere throughout the palace grounds. Let's talk now about your wife, Maria Theresa of Spain, whom you marry in 1660 as the crowning piece of a broader peace settlement, because royal marriages of your era are, at their core, essentially business mergers conducted with considerably better catering and considerably more elaborate ceremony. She is devout, gentle by temperament, and largely excluded from the genuine excitement of court life, spending the majority of her days quietly in the company of her small dogs and her deeply beloved cups of hot chocolate. You are, to put it as delicately as the situation allows, not a faithful husband in any meaningful sense, and yet she endures the entire arrangement with a quiet, steady patience, a queen forever orbiting a sun that only rarely bothers to shine directly upon her. The marriage itself is, from its very first arrangement, pure calculated statecraft. Maria Theresa is a Spanish princess, and thanks to the delightfully tangled family trees so characteristic of European royalty in this era, also happens to be your first cousin twice over. Your union is carefully arranged specifically to help seal a lasting peace between France and Spain following long, costly years of open warfare. Genuine romantic love does not enter into these particular negotiations in any meaningful way. She is, in the most practical sense, a walking peace treaty dressed in an elaborate wedding gown, and you are simply the other required signature. Two young royals bound together for life, entirely to serve the broader ambitions of their respective kingdoms. Romance, in your particular case, remains entirely optional, and as it turns out, largely unexercised. By virtually every surviving account, she is a genuinely kind and deeply pious soul, but she also remains, in many respects, somewhat adrift within your dazzling, endlessly sophisticated court. She never fully masters the French language during her entire time in France, clinging instead to her native Spanish throughout her life, and she demonstrates little genuine taste for the glittering intrigues and clever verbal games that constantly swirl around her at court. She is, quite simply, not built by temperament for the particular world you have so carefully constructed around yourself. While your court sparkles constantly with ambition and simmering scandal, she retreats instead into quiet, steady devotion, her regular prayers, her beloved small dogs, and her genuine, well-documented passion for hot chocolate, a treat she originally brought with her as a personal fondness from her native Spain. Your overall treatment of her is, frankly, not the finest chapter of your reign. You are openly and quite famously unfaithful throughout your marriage, conducting your various affairs with a boldness that leaves the unfortunate queen in very little genuine doubt about her true position within the court hierarchy. Your mistresses very often enjoy considerably more of your personal attention, your genuine conversation, and your actual evenings than your own wedded wife ever manages to receive. Maria Theresa is left, time and again, to watch as other women openly bask in precisely the warmth she herself was formally promised at the altar. It amounts to a genuinely lonely position, and she occupies it faithfully for decades, and yet she bears the entire arrangement with a dignity that remains genuinely touching to observe even centuries later. She does not rage openly, nor scheme quietly, nor attempt to claw back your wandering affection through calculated cunning of her own. She simply endures the situation, praying steadily for you, loving you in her own patient and thoroughly unglamorous way, and finding whatever genuine comfort she reasonably can in her faith and in her small, simple pleasures. There is a quiet, understated heroism embedded within her steadfastness, a genuine refusal to become bitter within a situation that would understandably sour almost anyone else's disposition entirely. She continues loving the sun even as it persists in warming others far more generously than it ever warms her. In one of history's small, quiet mercies, you do appear to hold a certain genuine affection and respect for her beneath all of the accumulated infidelity, and during her final years, the two of you do seem to grow somewhat closer emotionally. When she eventually dies, you are reported to have remarked that her passing was, in fact, the very first genuine trouble she had ever caused you throughout your entire marriage. A comment that reads either as a strangely tender compliment or as a deeply awkward one, depending entirely on how generously one chooses to interpret it. Either way, it captures rather perfectly the odd, gentle, distinctly one-sided nature of your entire marriage. Maria Theresa never receives the reign she genuinely deserved. She never holds the true spotlight of the court. She never truly captures the full heart of the man she formerly married. She remains, throughout, a good and faithful queen bound to a husband whose personal faith and attention wander constantly elsewhere. History remembers her, in the end, mostly as a footnote positioned alongside your own considerable glory, a patient shadow lingering quietly at the very edge of your radiance. And there is, when you sit with it honestly, something quietly sad embedded in that particular legacy. A woman who genuinely loved her chocolate and her small dogs, perhaps, because unlike so much else in her life, they at least never once left her waiting. While your patient queen waited quietly in the wings, your true romantic attention was captured elsewhere entirely. Beginning with a shy, genuinely love-struck young woman whose personal story would eventually end in the most dramatic possible retreat imaginable from your entire glittering world. Meet Louise de la Vallière, shy, sweet-natured, and genuinely, sincerely smitten with you as a person rather than simply with your crown, which makes her something close to a genuine rarity within your court. For a period of years, she becomes your recognized favorite, bearing you several children and quietly enduring the considerable weight of ongoing court gossip that inevitably follows such a position. But favor at Versailles, as you well understand from long experience, functions rather like a candle burning steadily in a persistent draft. As your restless attention gradually drifts elsewhere, poor Louise finds herself quietly, steadily pushed aside, and eventually she does something that no other royal mistress before her had ever dared to attempt. She leaves your entire dazzling world behind completely and becomes a nun, formally trading the palace for a life dedicated entirely to religious penance. What genuinely sets Louise apart from the more ambitious, calculating beauties who typically populate your court is the evident sincerity of her feelings. She is not, by any reasonable account, a calculating schemer angling deliberately for greater power and accumulated riches. She is instead a modest, somewhat naturally timid young woman who appears to have fallen genuinely, helplessly in love with you as an actual person, rather than simply with the considerable throne you happen to occupy. She even walks with a slight, noticeable limp, and she is certainly not considered the single most dazzling figure present at court on any given evening. And yet her evident tenderness and her genuine, visible devotion charm you completely nonetheless. In a world thoroughly built around calculated smiles and careful political positioning, her honest, unguarded affection strikes you as a genuinely rare and refreshing quality. For a considerable stretch of time, she becomes the object of your deepest romantic attention. Your extended affair with her unfolds against the vivid backdrop of your early reign, during those years when you remain genuinely young and passionate, and when the entire world seems to lie readily at your feet. She bears you several children over the following years, some of whom you formally acknowledge as your own, and she comes to occupy the coveted, genuinely dangerous position of the king's official favorite mistress. By any reasonable measure, this arrangement should represent the happiest period of her entire life. Instead, it becomes shadowed almost from its very beginning by her own persistent private guilt, and by the cruel, unforgiving arithmetic that governs favor within your court. Louise, as it happens, remains genuinely troubled throughout by the perceived sinfulness of her position at court. She is, at her core, a devout young woman knowingly carrying on an ongoing affair with an already married king, and her personal conscience never quite allows her to rest fully easy about the arrangement. She takes remarkably little genuine joy in the considerable wealth and elevated social status her position could reasonably bring her, and she seems, on the whole, almost to actively shrink away from the very spotlight that so many other ambitious women at court would eagerly kill to occupy in her place. Hers becomes a love genuinely tangled up with persistent shame, a happiness she cannot ever fully permit herself to feel completely, which makes her eventual fate all the more genuinely poignant to consider. Then, inevitably, the candle begins to gutter. Your restless romantic eye eventually lands upon another woman present at court, a figure considerably more dazzling and considerably more openly ambitious than gentle Louise, and Louise's star begins its own slow, genuinely painful descent from favor. For a period of time, she endures the genuinely unbearable humiliation of remaining physically present at court, while her direct rival steadily ascends in your affections, forced to personally witness her own gradual replacement, even sharing living quarters and public appearances in a cruel arrangement that must have felt, on a daily basis, like a form of ongoing personal torture. She is deliberately kept close at hand long after your heart has visibly moved on to someone else entirely, a fading favorite lingering quietly among the court's shadows. Eventually, she simply cannot bear the ongoing situation any longer, and she makes a choice that genuinely stuns the entire court and reveals, in the process, the the true depth of her original sincerity. She withdraws completely and entirely from your glittering world, entering a convent and taking up the hard, deliberately austere life of a religious nun. She trades fine silk for coarse religious cloth, abandons genuine luxury in favor of ongoing penance, exchanges the palace for a bare, simple cell. It amounts to a total, complete renunciation of everything she once possessed. A woman deliberately turning her back on the single most glamorous royal court in all of Europe, in pursuit of genuine forgiveness for a love she had never actually stopped feeling, despite believing it to be a genuine sin against her faith. And there she remains, for the entire remainder of her long life, absorbed in prayer and quiet religious discipline, far removed from the man who had once genuinely adored her. Of all your various loves across your long reign, Louise is perhaps the one who loved you most honestly, and who suffered most deeply as a direct consequence of that honest love. Her particular story serves as a sharp, lasting reminder that beneath all of the accumulated pageantry and raw power of your reign, real human hearts were genuinely being broken in the process, and that some of those broken hearts ultimately chose the profound silence of the cloister over the dazzling, ongoing cruelty of your court. If Louise represented romantic love in its shy, sorrowful form, her eventual successor was something else entirely. A woman possessed of such considerable wit, striking beauty, and towering personal ambition that she would come to effectively rule your court for years as a queen in absolutely everything but her formal title. Then comes Madame de Montespan, and she proves to be nothing whatsoever like the shy, retiring Louise. She is witty, genuinely gorgeous, sharp-tongued in the most entertaining possible way, and magnificently, unapologetically ambitious in pursuing her own interests. For years, she effectively reigns over your entire court as its unofficial queen. She bears you a considerable number of children over time, actively sets the prevailing court fashions that everyone else scrambles to imitate, and maintains a genuinely glittering little kingdom entirely her own, nestled comfortably within your larger kingdom. Being personally adored by the Sun King proves genuinely intoxicating for her, but it also proves, in equal measure, deeply precarious, because things that burn quite this brightly, as history repeatedly demonstrates, tend to attract dangerous, unwelcome attention sooner or later. Where gentle Louise was fundamentally timid by nature, Montespan is, by sharp contrast, a genuine force of nature in her own right. She is stunningly, undeniably beautiful, brilliantly clever in conversation, and possessed of a wit so genuinely sharp it could reportedly draw actual blood in verbal exchange. She dazzles you in ways that the considerably gentler Louise simply never quite managed, matching your own considerable intelligence directly and thoroughly delighting you with her sparkling conversation. She represents, in essence, exactly the kind of glittering, formidable woman perfectly suited to thrive within the intense hothouse atmosphere of your court, and she seizes her resulting position as your new favorite with both hands, apparently without any of the persistent guilt that so troubled her predecessor. Her extended reign as your chief mistress proves genuinely spectacular by any measure. She occupies grand apartments within the palace, at times considerably finer than the queen's own official quarters, and she surrounds herself openly with luxury on a scale that leaves contemporary observers genuinely gasping in astonishment. She bears you an entire brood of children across the years of your relationship, and these particular children you formally acknowledge and openly dote upon, personally arranging for their care and, eventually, their considerable social elevation. For a long, sustained stretch of your middle years as king, she functions, in every practical sense, as the true reigning woman of Versailles, the genuine queen of your heart and of your court, even if never formally of your actual kingdom. Montespan understands the underlying theater of power every bit as thoroughly as you yourself do, and she plays her own particular part within it quite magnificently. She actively sets the fashions that the entire court then scrambles eagerly to imitate. She generously patronizes talented artists and writers of the period. She hosts social gatherings that absolutely everyone at court longs desperately to attend. To find yourself genuinely in her personal favor is to find yourself, by direct extension, in the sun's favor as well, simply by proxy. And so the ambitious flock steadily toward her, flattering and actively courting the one woman who currently commands the king's deepest personal affection. She becomes, in her own right, a genuine power within the court, a glittering satellite that shines nearly as brightly as the sun itself. But this particular success is precisely where the underlying danger begins to accumulate. A royal favorite who burns this brightly and holds this much genuine sway inevitably attracts considerable envy, simmering resentment, and a growing number of determined enemies. Rival courtiers watch her hungrily, patiently waiting for even the smallest sign of your gradually cooling personal interest. Others whisper actively against her, openly jealous of both her accumulated wealth and her considerable influence over you personally. And you yourself, restless by nature as ever, are simply not the kind of man inclined to remain devoted indefinitely to any single woman, however genuinely dazzling she may be. The higher Montespan climbs within the court hierarchy, the further she inevitably has to eventually fall, and everyone present at court understands this basic dynamic perfectly well. For a good many years, though, she manages to hold her ground through sheer, sustained force of personality, successfully weathering your various other flirtations and repeatedly reasserting her firm hold over your attention time and again. She proves herself throughout to be a genuine fighter, entirely unwilling to fade away quietly in the manner that Louise eventually did. She battles persistently to maintain her central place within your world, employing all the considerable wit, beauty, and calculated cunning available to her. And for a remarkably long stretch of time, she genuinely succeeds in this ongoing battle. It stands as a real testament to just how extraordinary a woman she truly is that she manages to reign as your favorite for as long as she ultimately does. And yet, storm clouds are steadily gathering on the horizon, clouds that even the considerable charms of Montespan herself will ultimately prove unable to talk her way around. A genuinely terrifying scandal is beginning to stir quietly within the shadows of Paris, a dark, unsettling business involving poisons and secret occult rituals, one that will eventually reach upward toward the very highest circles of your court and brush uncomfortably close to the name of your own magnificent mistress. What begins as mere gossip circulating through the back alleys of Paris is about to become one of the most genuinely frightening episodes of your entire reign. Now the overall mood darkens considerably. A genuinely terrifying scandal erupts across Paris, involving fortune tellers, poisons, and secret occult rituals, and as investigators dig steadily deeper, they begin pulling shockingly powerful and well-connected names directly into the unfolding mess. The circulating whispers eventually brush uncomfortably close to Montespan herself, with persistent rumors suggesting that she had once sought dark, forbidden assistance specifically to help preserve your wavering personal affection. Whether these particular accusations are genuinely true, or instead wildly exaggerated by malicious rivals, remains fiercely debated by historians even today. But the underlying fear generated at the time was entirely real. The resulting trials were genuinely grim, and your once glittering court suddenly begins to feel a great deal less enchanted and a great deal more openly dangerous to inhabit. The entire affair begins, as these dark matters so often do, in the shadowy back corners of the city rather than within your own gilded palace halls. Paris, during these particular years, is home to a genuinely thriving criminal underworld of self-proclaimed fortune tellers and clandestine dealers in secret remedies. Individuals who openly claim to sell everything from simple love potions to considerably more sinister substances entirely. When royal investigators eventually begin pulling firmly on this particular thread, they discover it leads much further and considerably higher up the social ladder than anyone had originally anticipated. What initially appeared to be nothing more than petty back-alley trickery turns out, upon closer investigation, to directly touch the genuinely wealthy and the politically powerful people who, by any reasonable standard, really ought to have known considerably better. The royal authorities ultimately launch a serious, sustained investigation into the matter, and the deeper they dig into the underlying network, the considerably uglier the entire picture becomes. There are credible allegations of deliberate poisonings, of people actively seeking to hasten the deaths of inconvenient relatives or personal rivals through illicit means, and even darker claims still involving secret occult ceremonies conducted specifically in hopes of gaining romantic love or political power through entirely forbidden methods. It amounts to a genuinely frightening affair overall, part legitimate criminal conspiracy and part outright public hysteria, and it grips both the city and the royal court simultaneously in its grip. Suddenly, seemingly everyone at court finds themselves quietly wondering which of their acquaintances might have secretly dabbled in something genuinely dreadful. A special royal tribunal is formally established specifically to handle the growing flood of accusations, and the resulting legal proceedings prove genuinely grim throughout. Suspects are extensively questioned, some of them under formal torture, and the resulting confessions spill out naming person after person, several of them individuals of considerable existing social standing. The entire business threatens, at various points, to spiral entirely out of control into something resembling a full witch hunt, with genuine reputations being thoroughly destroyed on nothing more than the strength of rumor and coerced testimony extracted under considerable duress. It becomes increasingly difficult, as the investigation drags on, to determine precisely where genuine criminal activity ends and where simple fear and personal score settling begin. Which is, in itself, precisely what makes the entire situation so genuinely dangerous for everyone involved. And then, to your considerable personal horror, the circulating whispers begin to circle steadily closer toward your own beloved Montespan. Some of those formerly questioned during the investigation claim that she had, over the preceding years, sought out these shadowy occult figures herself, allegedly hopping either to secure your lasting romantic love or to actively harm certain personal rivals through illicit means. The resulting accusations are genuinely lurid and deeply alarming, and they place your magnificent, long-time mistress directly at the dark heart of the most frightening scandal of your entire reign. Whether there exists any genuine truth whatsoever within any of these particular claims, or whether she is instead simply the unfortunate victim of malicious testimony and thoroughly desperate accusers, remains a question that has been argued over extensively by historians ever since, without any truly tidy resolution ever being reached. You personally handle the entire unfolding situation with a degree of visible caution that reveals, quite clearly, just how genuinely shaken you are by the entire affair. The mere possibility that the woman closest to you for so many years might be genuinely entangled in such dark business proves entirely intolerable to you, both on a deeply personal level and in terms of the broader dignity of the crown itself. You take deliberate, careful steps to shield certain sensitive names from the very worst of the ongoing legal proceedings, and you eventually move decisively to bring the entire frightening affair to a definitive close before it can consume your court entirely from within. Some particular truths, you apparently decide in the end, are simply better left unexamined for the broader good of everyone involved, yourself, quite prominently, included in that calculation. The scandal leaves a lasting, permanent mark on your court regardless of its ultimate resolution. Your personal relationship with Montespan, already cooling gradually before the scandal broke, never fully recovers from the dark shadow it casts over everything that follows. More broadly than that, The entire episode strips away a significant portion of the enchantment previously associated with your court, exposing the genuine fear and underlying cruelty that could apparently lurk just beneath all that silk and expensive perfume. For a considerable period afterward, the glittering world you had so carefully built feels considerably less like an earthly paradise and considerably more like a place where literally anyone might find themselves just one single accusation away from complete ruin. Out of this uneasy, thoroughly disillusioned atmosphere, a very different kind of woman would eventually come to matter most to you during your remaining years. Someone genuinely serious, deeply pious, and utterly unlike the dazzling, ambitious mistresses who had defined your considerably younger years at court. In your later years, the woman who ultimately captures your deepest attention proves to be the most surprising of all your romantic attachments. Madame de Maintenon begins her time in your orbit as the discreet, carefully chosen governess responsible for the children born to you and Montespan, pious, serious by temperament, and utterly unimpressed by the glittering frivolity that defines so much of court life around her. Slowly, gradually, almost without either of you quite noticing the shift, she becomes your closest confidant, and after your queen finally dies, you secretly marry her in a private ceremony you never formally announce to the wider world. Under her steady, quiet influence, you grow considerably more solemn and devout with each passing year. The dancing sun of your vigorous youth gradually dims into something quieter, more genuinely religious, and far less inclined toward throwing another lavish party. Her particular path to your side is, by any measure, an unlikely one. She enters your immediate world in a genuinely modest professional capacity, entrusted specifically with the careful education and daily upbringing of the children born to you and Montespan during the height of that earlier relationship. She proves herself intelligent, deeply and sincerely religious, and possessed of a calm, remarkably sensible dignity that stands in genuinely sharp contrast to the glittering, endlessly scheming beauties who otherwise populate your court. She is not present in any sense to dazzle you or anyone else. She is there simply to work diligently, and she does so with a quiet, understated competence that gradually draws your genuine notice in a manner that all the accumulated fireworks of court life somehow never quite manage to achieve. What begins in its earliest stages as simple mutual respect gradually deepens over an extended period into something considerably more profound. You find yourself, almost without fully realizing it, increasingly seeking out her measured counsel, genuinely valuing her steady judgment on matters both personal and political, and thoroughly enjoying her serious, substantive conversation. Where your earlier romantic loves were characterized by tempests of raw passion and considerable public drama, this particular relationship is something calmer by comparison, and in its own quiet way, considerably more powerful and lasting. It amounts to genuine companionship rather than simple conquest, and after several decades spent pursuing the latter, you seem, in your more reflective moments, to genuinely crave the former instead. After Queen Maria Theresa eventually dies, you take a genuinely extraordinary step that surprises even those closest to you. You marry Madame de Maintenon in a private, deliberately secret ceremony, formally making her your wife in the recognized eyes of the Church, though never once your officially recognized queen in the eyes of the wider world. There is no grand public announcement of any kind, no formal coronation ceremony, no official acknowledgement whatsoever of the marriage's existence. She becomes, in practice, an unofficial yet immensely influential presence positioned at the very summit of your personal life, formally invisible to the outside world, yet privately indispensable to you in every meaningful sense. A genuine wife hidden carefully in plain sight, at the very heart of the most relentlessly public royal court anywhere in Europe. Under her sustained influence, you yourself genuinely change, and so, correspondingly, does the entire character of your court. The pious, considerably more serious atmosphere she personally embodies gradually replaces the wild, unrestrained extravagance that had defined your earlier decades as king. You grow noticeably more devout with each passing year, considerably more concerned with matters of your own soul and personal conduct, and generally more inclined toward sober religious reflection than toward the elaborate revelry of your younger days. Your court, as it always faithfully does, follows your lead in this matter, and Versailles itself gradually becomes a noticeably more solemn, more restrained place overall. The once endless parties and openly scandalous affairs steadily give way to a prevailing mood of genuine restraint and religious propriety. The sun, in its own extended evening years, turns increasingly thoughtful and inward. Not everyone at court genuinely welcomes this particular shift, it must be said. To certain long-time observers, the court operating under her quiet influence becomes rather noticeably duller than it once was, its old characteristic sparkle visibly dimmed by sustained prayer and increased propriety. There are those at court who openly resent her considerable influence over you, whispering privately that this particular woman of relatively modest origins holds far too much genuine sway over an aging king. But you yourself seem genuinely content with the change, even quietly comforted by it in your later years. After an entire lifetime built around performance and passion, there proves to be something genuinely restful in her steadiness, something that suits precisely the man you are gradually becoming as the accumulated years press down ever more heavily upon you. In the end, she is perhaps the truest, most enduring companion of your remarkably long life, the one person who remains genuinely present with you, not for your considerable radiance or your accumulated glory, but simply for yourself as a person, sharing faithfully in your later years through their various trials and accumulated sorrows. It proves, in many respects, a fitting turn for the overall story of a man who spent his vigorous youth as the dazzling center of every watching eye, that his final and most enduring love should ultimately be a quiet widow of modest origins, one who genuinely valued substance over spectacle, and who helped him face the gathering darkness of his final years with something approaching genuine peace. While your romantic life eventually settled into a period of relative calm, the extended family you had scattered across the decades of your long reign, both legitimate and otherwise, had grown into a genuinely sprawling, remarkably complicated dynasty that represented, in its own peculiar way, an achievement entirely its own. Let's attempt to properly tally your extended family, which turns out to represent a genuine organizational challenge in itself. Your formal marriage to Maria Theresa produces several children over the years, though, heartbreakingly, only one single son ultimately survives all the way into adulthood. Meanwhile, your various mistresses collectively provide you with an entire additional collection of sons and daughters, a great many of whom you openly and proudly acknowledge, subsequently legitimize through formal royal decree, and then eventually marry off strategically into the very highest ranks of French nobility. Your bloodline spreads gradually through the various royal courts of Europe rather like a persistent vine of ivy, and keeping proper track of precisely who is related to whom at any given family gathering would genuinely require a detailed chart and an extraordinarily patient personal assistant. Let's begin with your formally legitimate children, born specifically to Queen Maria Theresa over the course of your marriage. She bears you several children across these years, but the brutal underlying reality of your particular age, one in which even royal infants die with genuinely terrible frequency regardless of their elevated status, ultimately claims the great majority of them during early childhood. Only one child, your eldest son, formerly known throughout the court as the Grand Dauphin, survives long enough to grow into full adulthood. He is subsequently raised from birth as your designated heir, the future King of France, the single fragile thread upon which the entire direct royal succession officially hangs. In an age characterized by such staggering rates of infant mortality, even the most powerful king in Europe proves entirely unable to purchase genuine safety for his own children. Then there exists the considerable additional family produced across the years by your various mistresses. Louise de la Vallière provides you with several children during your relationship, and Madame de Montespan subsequently provides you with a whole further set of children during her own extended tenure as your favorite. These illegitimate sons and daughters become, taken together, a genuinely significant presence throughout your later life. Rather than concealing them away in shame, as many other monarchs of the period might reasonably have chosen to do, you instead adopt a strikingly public approach toward them. You formally acknowledge a great many of them as your own, legally legitimize their status through royal decree, grant them meaningful titles and elevated social standing, and actively fold them into the broader fabric of your court's daily life. Your considerable private life, it turns out, carries very public, carefully documented consequences arranged in neat, methodical rows within the official court records. The ongoing care of these particular children is itself deeply woven into the broader story, since it was precisely this specific responsibility that first brought Madame de Maintenon into your immediate personal orbit in the first place. Your various legitimized offspring are raised, on the whole, with considerable attention and genuine ambition invested in their futures, and you clearly feel real, sustained affection and evident pride toward a great many of them individually. You go to considerable personal lengths to secure their respective futures within French society, sometimes to the visible irritation of the older, more traditionally pure noble houses, who bristle openly at watching the king's natural children elevated so dramatically above their technical birth status. You are, in effect, quietly constructing an entire second royal family running alongside your first, official one. The strategic marrying off of all these numerous children becomes, in itself, a grand and intricate game of dynastic chess played out over decades. You carefully arrange various unions specifically designed to strengthen existing political alliances, to tie great noble families more closely to the crown, and to weave your considerable bloodline steadily into the highest social circles of nobility, both within France itself and across the wider courts of Europe. A remarkable number of your legitimized daughters marry directly into the most exalted noble houses of the entire realm. Through these carefully arranged matches, your descendants and your broader personal influence spread steadily outward, generation after generation, until your blood eventually runs through a significant portion of European royalty as a whole. There is, admittedly, considerable political calculation embedded within all of this careful arranging, but there is also, quite genuinely, real personal feeling involved as well. You are, for all your considerable accumulated grandeur, still fundamentally a father, and the various losses you suffer among your own children wound you deeply, precisely as they would wound any ordinary parent facing similar circumstances. The deaths of the young, the persistent fragility of the royal succession, the constant looming shadow of mortality hanging over even the most carefully protected royal nursery. These represent genuine, deeply felt sorrows existing quietly beneath all the visible dynastic maneuvering and political calculation. Behind the elaborate chessboard of arranged marriages and formal titles stands a man who ultimately buries far too many of his own children and grandchildren over the course of his unusually long life. By the very height of your reign, then, your extended family has become a genuinely sprawling, remarkably complicated web of both legitimate and legitimized branches, sons and daughters, counts and duchesses scattered widely across the various royal courts of the European continent. It amounts to an entire empire of descendants constructed to match your broader empire of accumulated glory, a living monument to a genuinely long and remarkably eventful personal life. Successfully managing it all represents a considerable feat in its own right, and it speaks clearly to just how thoroughly and comprehensively you managed to stamp your own personal mark upon your entire historical age. Not every member of your extended royal family fit neatly into this carefully managed overall design, however, and none proved quite so colorful, nor quite so carefully and deliberately managed by you personally, as your own younger brother, a man of genuinely dazzling personal flamboyance, and rather inconveniently for you, surprising natural military talent. Meet your younger brother Philippe, known simply throughout the court as Monsieur, and he proves himself a genuinely remarkable character in his own right. He is flamboyant by nature, deeply fond of fine jewels, elevated heels, and the latest court gossip. Openly enjoys the romantic company of men in a manner considerably more visible than the strict social conventions of your era might otherwise suggest, was entirely safe for him, and is also, rather inconveniently for your own peace of mind, a genuinely gifted battlefield commander when given the opportunity to demonstrate it. You handle this particular combination of traits precisely as a suspicious, security-conscious monarch would be expected to. You shower him generously with luxury and elevated social status, while simultaneously and carefully ensuring that he never gains access to any genuine political power of his own. Better, you reason, to keep a genuinely talented brother happy and thoroughly harmless than to risk him potentially becoming a serious rival to your throne. Philippe proves himself, by virtually every surviving account, a genuinely remarkable figure in his own right. He delights openly in fine jewelry, in fashionable clothing, and in the considerable pleasures of active court life, and he makes little genuine secret of his romantic preference for the company of men, living rather more openly in this particular regard than the prevailing social conventions of your age might reasonably suggest was entirely wise or safe. He is witty, genuinely charming, and thoroughly immersed in the social and stylish life of Versailles, where you personally cultivate the carefully constructed image of the radiant, majestic Sun King. Your own brother instead cultivates a rather more sparkling, unapologetically extravagant personal persona entirely his own. The underlying origins of his particular character owe something meaningful to how the two of you were originally raised together as children. There is reasonable historical evidence to suggest that those responsible for your shared upbringing deliberately encouraged Philippe toward frivolity and softness from an early age, precisely so that he would never grow into a genuine political threat to your throne later in life. A younger brother possessing serious military ambition combined with a genuine taste for accumulated power could, after all, prove terribly dangerous to a reigning king. A younger brother instead thoroughly absorbed in fashion and personal pleasure remains, by contrast, considerably safer for everyone involved. Whether by deliberate design or simply by his own natural inclination, Philippe grew into a man far more genuinely interested in the pleasures of court life than in the pursuit of military conquest. And yet, here comes the genuine twist that must have given you considerable private pause over the years. When Philippe does eventually take to an actual battlefield, he proves himself genuinely, surprisingly excellent at the practice of warfare. He leads troops with real, demonstrated skill and personal courage, winning several notable military successes, and demonstrating a genuine talent for battlefield command that virtually nobody at court had originally expected from such an outwardly flamboyant figure. It turns out, rather inconveniently, that the brother known primarily for his jeweled heels genuinely possesses the underlying makings of a formidable general, precisely the sort of unexpected discovery that a naturally suspicious king does not particularly want to make about a brother with a legitimate, if distant, claim to his own throne. Your response to this discovery proves genuinely telling in retrospect. Rather than actively encouraging this evident military talent and providing your capable brother with genuine opportunities to build an independent power base of his own, you instead gently but firmly steer him away from any further significant military opportunities going forward. You remain generous toward him in almost every other conceivable way, granting him considerable wealth, magnificent residences, elevated social status, and virtually every luxury he could reasonably desire. But genuine political and military power, the specific kind that could one day potentially rival your own authority, you keep firmly, deliberately out of his practical reach. You give him, in effect, everything except the single thing that might realistically make him dangerous to your position. It represents, in the end, a shrewd, if admittedly somewhat emotionally cold, piece of calculated statecraft on your part. You understand, as you always have throughout your reign, that the greatest genuine threats facing any king very often emerge from within his own family circle, from ambitious relatives who happen to possess a legitimate claim to the royal bloodline. By deliberately keeping Philippe wealthy, comfortable, and thoroughly distracted with the pleasures of court life, you successfully neutralize this particular potential threat, while simultaneously maintaining a genuinely affectionate personal relationship with your brother throughout both your lives. He remains throughout, your brother and your companion, a vivid and colorful presence at your court, but never once your genuine political competitor. The two of you experience your fair share of quarrels over the years, as brothers naturally do, but the overall arrangement largely holds firm throughout both your lifetimes. Philippe lives out his genuinely colorful life at the very heart of your glittering world, and you sleep soundly each night knowing that his considerable natural talents will never realistically be turned directly against your own position. It stands as yet another clear example of your defining personal instinct, the very same instinct that built an entire palace out of a swamp and successfully tamed an entire restless nobility, applied here even to the management of your own flesh and blood. Everyone, it turns out, even a beloved brother, must ultimately orbit the sun and never once threaten to eclipse it. That same restless, deeply ingrained drive to dominate, to loom ever larger across the entire European continent, did not confine itself merely to the careful management of family and court life. For above virtually everything else, you genuinely hungered for glory on the actual battlefield, and that particular hunger would come to shape, and ultimately exhaust, your entire lengthy reign as king. You possess a genuine hunger, and its proper name is gloire, meaning glory in the fullest sense, and it drives you steadily into war after war across the full span of your reign. You fight consistently for additional territory, for accumulated prestige, and for the sheer visceral thrill of watching France loom ever larger and more dominant on the map of Europe. Your assembled armies are, by any reasonable measure, the finest in all of Europe. Your generals prove genuinely brilliant in the field. Your ambitions remain essentially boundless throughout your reign, but glory, as you gradually discover over the decades, proves genuinely expensive both in accumulated gold and in countless human lives, and every hard-won triumph plants the seeds for the next exhausting, costly conflict. The Sun King, it seems, is never quite finished shining brightly upon a battlefield. This particular appetite for military glory sits genuinely central to who you fundamentally are as a person and as a ruler. You sincerely believe that a truly great king proves his greatness primarily through sustained military triumph, through the steady expansion of his realm, and through the humbling of his various rivals on the international stage. War, to your mind, represents not merely a grim, unavoidable necessity, but a genuine stage upon which to demonstrate your own considerable magnificence to the watching world. You want France to be genuinely feared and openly admired in equal measure, its borders steadily pushed outward, its overall power left thoroughly unquestioned by any rival, and you want your own name written large across the annals of military conquest, remembered permanently as a monarch who made his kingdom substantially greater than he found it. For a considerable portion of your reign, you possess the practical tools necessary to genuinely pursue this ambitious dream. Thanks in very large part to the tireless work of ministers like Colbert, who steadily build up both your standing army and your royal treasury over many years. France fields military forces of genuinely remarkable size and quality, ranking among the most formidable fighting forces found anywhere in Europe. You are consistently served by gifted military commanders and skilled engineers who thoroughly master the intricate art of siege warfare and fortified defense. When you personally choose to go to war, you very often go specifically to win. And in the earlier decades of your reign especially, when you do frequently win, you steadily seize additional territory while further burnishing your already fearsome international reputation. Your various military campaigns unfold steadily across the decades in a long, connected series of conflicts fought against ever-shifting combinations of rival European powers, who grow increasingly alarmed over time by the sheer scale of your accumulating ambition. Each individual war carries its own tangled underlying causes and official justifications, but running consistently through all of them is that same driving hunger to enlarge and glorify France under your personal rule. You steadily add territory here, strengthen your strategic position there, and each individual success further feeds your growing appetite for the next conquest. The map of Europe itself gradually shifts and reshapes under the sustained pressure of your ceaseless personal striving. But glory, as you slowly and painfully discover over time, proves to be a genuinely ravenous force that devours considerably more than it ever actually gives back in return. Every single war costs enormous, staggering sums of money, steadily draining the royal treasury that your ministers work so tirelessly hard to keep adequately filled. Every campaign costs real human lives, both the soldiers who fall directly on the battlefield and, indirectly, the ordinary civilian population who bear the considerable burden of increased taxation and general hardship back at home. And every hard-won triumph tends, over time, to genuinely frighten your neighboring rivals into banding together more tightly against you, so that your own accumulating success gradually breeds ever larger and more determined coalitions specifically formed to check your growing power. The overall business of winning grows measurably harder as the years steadily wear on. By the considerably later portion of your reign, the fundamental character of your wars begins to noticeably change. The relatively easy victories that characterized your vigorous youth steadily give way to grinding, genuinely costly struggles fought against powerful, coordinated alliances of rival powers. Conflicts that stretch on for years without delivering the glorious, decisive results you once reliably enjoyed in your younger days. France itself, genuinely exhausted and increasingly impoverished by decades of nearly continuous fighting, begins to visibly buckle under the accumulated strain. The very hunger for gloire that once drove you steadily toward genuine greatness now threatens, in your later years, to consume the very kingdom you originally set out to exalt and elevate. The sun's considerable ambition has, in the end, cost the surrounding sky a very great deal indeed. In the final analysis, your sustained pursuit of military glory leaves behind a genuinely mixed historical legacy. You did indeed succeed in making France a genuinely dominant continental power, and in substantially expanding its overall borders, and your reign is remembered, quite rightly, as a genuine high point of French military and political might. But the considerable price paid in gold, in blood, and in years of accumulated suffering proved genuinely staggering, and the great majority of that price was ultimately borne by ordinary people who saw remarkably little of the associated glory themselves. It stands as a genuinely hard lesson regarding the true underlying cost of a king's personal ambition, and it was certainly not the only decision of yours that history would eventually come to judge quite harshly. Now we arrive at a considerably heavier chapter in your story, and it genuinely deserves a sober, careful tone throughout. For many decades prior to your personal rule, French Protestants, commonly known as the Huguenots, had lived under a hard-won legal protection called the Edict of Nantes. In 1685, you formally revoked this long-standing protection, effectively ending their established legal right to worship freely according to their own faith. The resulting consequences prove genuinely severe. Countless families face active persecution, and enormous numbers of them ultimately choose to flee the country entirely, carrying their considerable skills and their established trades directly to your international rivals abroad. You sincerely believe at the time that you are successfully unifying your kingdom under a single unified faith. History, by contrast, records the decision as one of the gravest, most genuinely costly mistakes of your entire reign. To fully understand the true weight of this particular decision, you first have to properly understand the Edict of Nantes itself. Decades before your own reign began, it was originally issued specifically to bring lasting peace to a France that had been thoroughly torn apart by brutal, sustained religious warfare between Catholics and Protestants. It granted the Protestant minority population, the Huguenots, a genuine measure of legal protection and the formal right to practice their chosen faith, and for many subsequent years. It allowed the two religious communities to coexist within France, however uneasily at times. It represented a genuinely hard-won settlement born directly out of terrible, sustained bloodshed, and it successfully held the underlying peace for multiple generations afterward. You, however, come over time to see this persistent religious division within your kingdom as fundamentally intolerable. You hold firmly and sincerely to the belief that a truly great king should properly rule over a single, unified faith. That one king, one law, and one religion together represent the proper, natural order of a well-governed kingdom. The continued existence of a sizable Protestant minority population within your borders offends this deeply held vision of a perfectly harmonized kingdom, operating under your absolute personal authority. Over an extended period of time, mounting pressure on the Huguenot population steadily increases. Through growing legal restrictions and increasingly harsh coercive measures, specifically designed to push them steadily toward religious conversion, eventually culminating in your fateful decision to revoke their established legal protection altogether. When you formally revoke the edict, the resulting effects prove immediate and genuinely harsh. Protestant worship is officially outlawed throughout the kingdom. Their established churches are systematically destroyed. Their religious ministers are formally ordered out of the country, or worse still. Families that have faithfully practiced their particular faith for multiple generations are suddenly and officially declared outlaws within their own native country, subjected to a wide range of genuinely grim coercive measures, specifically designed to pressure them into abandoning their sincerely held beliefs. It amounts, in practice, to a sustained campaign of religious coercion that inflicts very real, sustained suffering on a great many of your own loyal subjects, people whose only genuine offense consists of worshiping somewhat differently than their own king. This particular chapter of your reign does not lend itself readily to any lighter tone, and it genuinely should not. Faced with these harsh new realities, enormous numbers of Huguenots make the genuinely wrenching personal decision to flee France entirely, despite formal laws explicitly forbidding them from leaving the kingdom. They escape across international borders and treacherous seas toward Protestant lands willing to take them in as refugees, abandoning their established homes and accumulated possessions entirely in order to seek the basic freedom to worship according to their own conscience elsewhere. It amounts to a genuinely vast exodus, one of the great forced refugee movements of the entire era, and it scatters established French Protestant communities across Europe and beyond its borders entirely. Those who ultimately choose to leave carry with them their considerable grief, their sustained faith, and something else of genuinely enormous practical value to whichever nation receives them as refugees. That something else is skill. The Huguenot population includes a great many genuinely accomplished craftsmen, established merchants, and highly skilled workers, precisely the sort of talented, economically productive people that any reasonable kingdom would strongly wish to retain within its own borders. When they flee in such numbers, They take their considerable expertise, their established industries, and their valuable commercial connections directly with them, thereby enriching the very rival nations that welcome them as refugees. France, in effect, hands a genuine gift of accumulated talent and economic enterprise directly to its international competitors, measurably weakening itself economically in the very act of attempting to purify itself religiously according to your personal vision. History has judged this particular decision quite harshly over the subsequent centuries, and with genuinely good reason. In pursuit of a single unified national faith, you inflicted very real, sustained suffering on your own loyal subjects, meaningfully damaged your kingdom's overall economy, and handed considerable practical advantages directly to your international enemies, all while simultaneously doing lasting, measurable harm to France's broader reputation abroad. Whatever you sincerely believed yourself to be achieving at the time, the true underlying cost proved genuinely immense and remarkably long-lasting in its consequences. It stands, in retrospect, as a genuinely sobering reminder that even a king widely hailed as the living sun could cast an extraordinarily long and genuinely dark shadow over those unfortunate enough not to fit neatly within his particular vision of a properly ordered kingdom. The considerable, accumulated costs of your reign were certainly not borne solely by the Huguenot population, however, because beneath all of the visible splendor and grand ambition of your court lay a much larger and considerably quieter mass of entirely ordinary people who paid, in the hardest possible currency imaginable, for the accumulated glory that surrounded you throughout your reign. Behind all of that gold leaf and those elaborate dancing fountains lies a considerably quieter, more uncomfortable truth. Someone, after all, has to actually pay for the endless wars, for the palace construction, for the lavish parties, and that someone turns out to be, overwhelmingly, the ordinary common people of France. Peasant farmers labor tirelessly under genuinely crushing tax burdens to fund a level of splendor they themselves will never once personally touch or experience. When brutal winters arrive combined with failed harvests, widespread famine reliably follows, and the surrounding countryside suffers terribly and extensively, while your own royal court continues to glitter on entirely undisturbed. The overall distance separating your marble palace halls from their own genuinely empty dinner tables grows measurably wider with each passing year of your extended reign. The underlying structure of taxation within your kingdom proves deeply, systematically unfair, and it consistently falls hardest upon precisely those members of society least able to reasonably bear its weight. The great established nobility and the powerful clergy enjoy sweeping, traditional exemptions from many of the very heaviest financial burdens imposed by the crown. So the overwhelming weight of actually funding the state descends disproportionately upon the common working people, the peasant farmers and ordinary laborers who together make up the vast, overwhelming majority of the total population. They toil steadily to produce the underlying wealth that flows consistently upward to sustain your standing armies, your ambitious building projects, and the dazzling daily life of your royal court, receiving remarkably little of any genuine value in return, beyond an endlessly repeated demand for still more. For these ordinary common people, daily life proves genuinely hard in ways that the glittering world of Versailles could scarcely even begin to imagine or comprehend. They work the surrounding land through long, physically exhausting days, entirely at the mercy of unpredictable weather patterns and the changing seasons, always painfully aware that a single bad harvest could plausibly mean genuine disaster for their entire family. Their modest homes remain humble, their available diets genuinely meager, their overall existence a constant, exhausting negotiation with persistent hunger and material want. And over the top of all of this hangs the ever-present demand of the royal tax collector, steadily claiming a meaningful share of whatever little they manage to produce, specifically to help feed the considerable appetites of your expanding state. When nature periodically turns against them, as it reliably and repeatedly does throughout your long reign, the resulting consequences prove genuinely devastating. Harsh winters combined with failed harvests bring recurring famine to the French countryside. And during the very worst of these recurring episodes, genuinely great numbers of ordinary people suffer terribly and ultimately die as a direct result. Cold temperatures, persistent hunger, and rampant disease sweep steadily through entire villages already stretched well past their reasonable breaking point. These represent, importantly, not distant historical abstractions, but real, documented catastrophes visited directly upon real families, and they unfold even as your own royal court continues its endless ceremonies and celebrations entirely undisturbed. The two separate worlds, divided by a gulf almost too wide to properly comprehend. The overall contrast, when viewed honestly and without flattering illusion, proves genuinely stark and deeply troubling. In your own palace, water is deliberately made to dance elaborately in ornamental fountains, and food is regularly served in such genuine abundance that a considerable portion of it goes cold during its long, ceremonial journey to your personal table. In the surrounding countryside, meanwhile, ordinary people struggle desperately simply to find enough food to eat, and they shiver miserably through harsh winters they may not ultimately survive. The very same kingdom simultaneously contains both the most extravagant royal court found anywhere in Europe and vast multitudes of people living perpetually on the very edge of basic survival. And the considerable splendor of the one rests quite squarely upon the sustained labor and accumulated suffering of the other. None of this is meant to suggest that you personally remain entirely indifferent to the suffering of your people, in the manner of some cartoonish villain from a simple morality tale. Rulers throughout your particular historical era largely take such deep structural inequalities for granted as simply representing the natural, unchangeable way the world happens to be ordered. But the sheer scale of your personal ambitions, the endless wars, the magnificent palace, the relentless, sustained pursuit of military and cultural glory, collectively demands a level of resource extraction from your kingdom that presses down genuinely hard upon those positioned at the very bottom of French society. Your considerable greatness, in a very real and measurable sense, is built quite directly upon their backs, and the accumulated burden only grows measurably heavier as your reign steadily lengthens across the decades. This widening gap separating the glittering few from the struggling many does not simply disappear once you yourself are gone from the scene. The accumulated resentments and genuine hardships that build up steadily across your long reign help lay the essential groundwork for troubles that will eventually shake the entire kingdom of France to its very foundations, long after your own time on the throne has ended. The magnificent world you so carefully built came at a very real price, paid largely by ordinary people whose individual names history never bothered to properly record. And that particular unpaid debt would go on to cast a genuinely long shadow over the kingdom you ultimately left behind for your successors to inherit. Even a king who could command such genuinely vast resources and impose such considerable burdens upon others, however, could not ultimately command his own physical body. And the man who ruled France so thoroughly and absolutely was, in the end, every bit as helpless as any of his humblest subjects before the crude, genuinely painful medicine of his particular age. Being king, as it turns out, does not remotely spare you from the considerable horrors of period medical practice. Your personal physicians purge your body relentlessly throughout your life, and your teeth suffer genuinely catastrophic damage over time, in part because a poorly executed attempt to remove several problem teeth ends up seriously damaging your upper jaw in the process. Then there is the genuinely famous surgical operation of 1686, when your surgeons treat a painful anal fistula by cutting directly into your body with no meaningful anesthesia, beyond your own sheer force of personal willpower. You endure the entire ordeal with astonishing outward composure, and bizarrely enough, the surgery itself subsequently becomes fashionable among courtiers, with several reportedly requesting the identical procedure performed on themselves purely in order to imitate their king. Loyalty, it turns out, genuinely has no reasonable limits at your court. The medical care so generously lavished upon you, for all its supposed period sophistication, amounts, by any modern standard, to a sustained form of ongoing physical torment. Your attending physicians are firm, sincere believers in the considerable medical value of regularly purging the body, subjecting you to a relentless, sustained regimen of bloodletting, enemas, and various other genuinely unpleasant treatments, all specifically intended to keep your body's internal humors in proper balance according to contemporary medical theory. You endure countless such medical interventions across the full span of your lifetime, each one genuinely draining and deeply uncomfortable, all conducted in the sincere name of preserving your precious royal health. Being the single most important patient in all of France means, in practice, being the most enthusiastically and relentlessly treated patient in the entire kingdom, which turns out not to be nearly the blessing it might initially sound like. Your teeth, in particular, fare especially badly over the years. Dental care during your particular era is crude at absolute best, and your own royal mouth gradually becomes a persistent source of considerable ongoing misery. At one point, a poorly executed attempt to extract several troublesome teeth from your upper jaw goes badly, seriously wrong, meaningfully damaging the jaw itself, and leaving you with a lasting, permanent problem. The ultimate result is a mouth beset by chronic difficulty, measurably affecting how you are able to eat, and reportedly even causing related complications with your sinuses as well. The Sun King, radiant and flawless in every commissioned portrait, privately contends throughout his life with the very ordinary, genuinely painful indignities of steadily failing teeth. But the single most famous medical episode of your entire reign remains the surgical operation of 1686. You develop, over time, a genuinely painful and medically serious condition, an anal fistula that stubbornly refuses to heal on its own, and that eventually demands direct surgical intervention to properly address. In an age entirely without effective anesthesia of any kind, this means formally submitting to the surgeon's knife while remaining fully conscious throughout the entire procedure, enduring the blade with absolutely nothing available to dull the considerable pain beyond your own personal resolve and self-discipline. It represents a genuinely terrifying prospect for absolutely anyone facing it, king or common subject alike, and it hangs heavily over your entire royal court like a slowly gathering storm in the days leading up to the scheduled procedure. As the appointed day finally arrives, and the operation itself proceeds, you face the entire ordeal with a degree of outward composure that genuinely astonishes everyone gathered around you. The attending surgeon, who has reportedly prepared himself with considerable care for the procedure, successfully performs the operation, and you bear the entire ordeal with remarkable personal dignity and courage. Showing remarkably little outward sign of the considerable agony you must genuinely be experiencing throughout. It proves, by the general medical standards of your particular day, a considerable surgical success, and your subsequent recovery, though genuinely slow and painful, eventually restores you to reasonably good health. Your considerable fortitude throughout the entire ordeal becomes the talk of the entire court, and it further burnishes your already considerable personal legend. Then comes the genuinely bizarre part of this particular story. So great is your accumulated personal prestige, and so eager are your assembled courtiers to associate themselves closely with anything the king himself has personally done, that the surgical operation itself actually becomes fashionable among the nobility. Astonishingly, some noblemen reportedly present themselves voluntarily to surgeons requesting the exact same painful procedure, whether they actually medically need it or not, purely in order to share directly in the experience of their reigning monarch. It amounts, in practice, to devotion carried to a genuinely alarming extreme, a sincere willingness to undergo genuinely painful surgery simply because the king himself had previously done so. One can only reasonably imagine that the attending surgeons were left about as thoroughly baffled by the whole business as they were suddenly, unexpectedly busy. The entire affair captures something genuinely essential about both your reign and your broader historical era. Here stands the single most powerful man in all of Europe, surrounded by every conceivable luxury imaginable, and yet still utterly at the mercy of the genuinely primitive medicine of his particular time, enduring physical pain that no conceivable amount of accumulated gold could ever meaningfully soften or reduce. And here, simultaneously, stands a royal court so thoroughly devoted, or perhaps simply so genuinely desperate for royal favor, that it would willingly choose to imitate even his physical suffering. Behind all of the considerable splendor, you remain, in the end, simply flesh and blood like absolutely everyone else around you. And the accumulated years of hard living combined with even harder period medicine steadily, relentlessly take their inevitable toll on your aging body. As those accumulated years steadily pile up over your remarkably long reign, they bring with them a particular sorrow, considerably deeper than any physical pain you had previously endured. For your extraordinarily long life on the throne means that you are ultimately fated to watch, one by one, as those specifically meant to eventually succeed you are instead taken from this world before you yourself finally depart it. The final years of your reign bring with them a genuinely cruel and unexpected form of loneliness. You reign for such an extraordinarily long stretch of time that you eventually begin to outlive your own designated heirs entirely. Your only surviving son dies before you. Then, not long afterward, your grandson dies as well. Then still more members of your immediate family follow in rapid, genuinely devastating succession, as a wave of sudden illness sweeps steadily through your extended royal household. One by one, the very people specifically meant to follow you onto the throne are instead lowered into the ground well before you yourself are. By the very end of your life, your designated royal heir has become nothing more than a tiny great-grandson, a small, vulnerable child who will one day inherit the entirety of everything you personally spent your whole long lifetime carefully constructing. The sheer, considerable length of your reign, which represents one of your very greatest personal boasts throughout your lifetime, becomes, in your final years, a genuine source of profound personal grief instead. You have sat upon the French throne for so many consecutive decades that the natural, expected order of royal succession itself begins to break down in the most painful, unnatural way imaginable. You are meant, under any normal circumstances, to be eventually succeeded by your own son, and he in turn by his own son, in the orderly, expected passing of the crown from one generation to the very next. Instead, you personally live so extraordinarily long that death arrives repeatedly for the considerably younger generations, while you, the aging king, remain stubbornly behind. The devastating blows fall with genuinely terrible speed during these final years. Your only surviving legitimate son, the Grand Dauphin, the very heir you personally raised and carefully prepared across so many years for his eventual succession, dies before you do. It represents a genuinely devastating personal loss, but the accumulated sorrow does not end there, unfortunately. In a genuinely cruel, compressed span of time, sudden illness sweeps steadily through your extended family, claiming your grandson, who had by then become your new designated heir, along with his own wife, and then reaching even further into the following generation as well. Within the space of a remarkably short and genuinely brutal period, you lose heir after heir in rapid succession, watching the carefully maintained line of royal succession you had counted on for decades essentially collapse entirely before your own eyes. It proves genuinely difficult to fully imagine the sheer emotional weight of such repeated, compounding grief. You are, by this point, an elderly man, thoroughly worn down by decades of continuous rule, and instead of receiving the natural comfort of seeing your own descendants properly prepared to carry forward your considerable legacy, you instead find yourself repeatedly forced to bury them one after another. A parent burying a child represents, under any circumstances, one of the deepest and most universal forms of human sorrow imaginable, and you personally endure this particular grief repeatedly across multiple successive generations, as those who reasonably should have outlived you are instead taken from this world well before their time. All of your considerable power, all of your accumulated glory, all of the vast resources available to the greatest kingdom in all of Europe prove entirely unable to shield your own family from the relentless, indiscriminate reach of disease and death. By the time this devastating wave of family deaths finally subsides, your designated royal heir has been reduced to nothing more than a small, vulnerable child, a young great-grandson who now stands to inherit the vast, remarkably complicated kingdom you have spent your entire long lifetime so carefully constructing. It represents a genuinely precarious situation, with the entire future of France now resting upon the fragile, uncertain life of a very young child, and it must weigh very heavily upon you indeed as you contemplate, in your own final days, the eventual end of your own remarkably long life. There proves to be a genuinely bitter irony embedded within all of this personal tragedy that simply cannot escape your notice. Your own extraordinary longevity, the remarkably long reign that set you so far above every other monarch of your particular era, has ultimately cost you the ordinary, expected comfort of a natural, orderly succession. You have, in the most literal and genuinely heartbreaking sense imaginable, outshone your own entire family, remaining steadily upon the throne while those specifically meant to eventually follow you have instead passed quietly into shadow ahead of you. The sun that stubbornly refused to set has watched its entire surrounding sky gradually go dark around it, one star extinguished at a time. These repeated, compounding losses lend a genuinely somber, elegiac quality to your final years on the throne. Years already made considerably more solemn by advancing age and by the quiet, steady religious influence of your final companion. The once dazzling young king who danced so memorably as Apollo is now, by contrast, an elderly, grieving man surrounded by empty places at his own dinner table, quietly contemplating a future he personally will never live to see, and a considerable legacy he must now reluctantly entrust to a small, vulnerable child. It represents a genuinely poignant close to a life defined by such overwhelming personal grandeur, a clear reminder that no conceivable amount of accumulated glory can ever fully purchase a life entirely free from sorrow. And so, at long last, we arrive at the genuine end of the longest reign in the living memory of all Europe, at the closing of an entire historical era, so vast in scope that remarkably few of your own subjects could genuinely recall a time before you personally sat upon the throne, and at the final setting of the sun that had blazed steadily over France for the better part of an entire century. And so we finally reach the end, in the year 1715. Gangrene takes hold steadily in your leg, and even the single most powerful man in all of Europe ultimately proves unable to command his own failing body to simply obey him. You die just before your 77th birthday, having reigned for an almost unbelievable 72 consecutive years, the longest recorded reign of any major European monarch throughout the entire continent's history. You leave behind you a genuinely dazzling palace, a thoroughly exhausted royal treasury, and a considerable legend that continues to glitter across the centuries that follow. The Sun King finally sets, and France itself quietly exhales, blinking uncertainly into a considerably quieter morning ahead. Your final illness proves to be a genuinely grim, drawn-out affair overall. During your last summer alive, a painful affliction takes hold steadily in your leg, and it soon reveals itself, to the considerable alarm of your attending physicians, to be gangrene, a condition entirely beyond the practical power of contemporary medicine to properly cure. There proves to be, in the end, no realistic saving you from this particular fate. The disease advances steadily and relentlessly, and you, a man who once commanded entire armies and successfully bent an entire kingdom to your personal will, can ultimately do nothing more than simply endure its inexorable progress. Even absolute royal power, it turns out in the final analysis, has its own absolute practical limit, and you have finally, unavoidably reached it. To your very considerable credit, you meet your own approaching end much as you had once faced the surgeon's knife decades earlier, with remarkable personal dignity and steady composure throughout. You take the necessary time to properly set your remaining affairs in careful order, to formally bid farewell to those closest around you, and to offer whatever guidance you reasonably can to the small great-grandson who will soon succeed you on the throne. There are surviving reports of genuinely touching final scenes, of an elderly king patiently counseling a small child on the considerable burdens that come with wearing the crown, urging him specifically to avoid the costly wars and reckless extravagance that had ultimately cost France so dearly across your own long reign. Even in your very final days, you remain genuinely conscious of your own lasting legacy and its considerable accumulated weight. You die in early September, just barely short of your 77th birthday, bringing to a definitive close a reign of genuinely staggering overall length, 72 full years spent upon the throne, a span so extraordinarily long that the vast majority of your own subjects have personally never known any other reigning king, have never once lived through a single day of their entire lives without you positioned at the very summit of their world. To a great many of them, you are considerably less a mortal man than a permanent, unchanging feature of daily existence itself, as fixed and reliably expected as the sun rising each morning. And now, almost impossibly to comprehend, that fixed point in their world is finally, genuinely gone. The considerable legacy you leave behind proves every bit as vast, and every bit as genuinely contradictory as your reign itself. There stands Versailles, the magnificent palace that so thoroughly dazzled the entire watching world and subsequently became the envied model for virtually every other royal court across Europe. There exists the powerful image of French national greatness, of an entire nation deliberately raised to genuine dominance and considerable cultural brilliance under your extended personal rule. But there also exists a thoroughly exhausted royal treasury, drained dry by decades of continuous warfare and personal extravagance, and a common population genuinely worn down by sustained taxation and accumulated hardship, quietly carrying resentments that will, in time, eventually help ignite a full-scale revolution decades after your own death. Your considerable personal glory and your kingdom's genuine suffering remain, in the end, inseparably bound together throughout history. The broader public reaction to your eventual death proves genuinely telling in retrospect. While your reign is formally mourned in the grand, expected ceremonial sense befitting a monarch of your stature, there are also documented reports of genuine quiet relief circulating among a general population thoroughly weary of the sustained wars and accumulated burdens that had characterized your final decades on the throne. The once dazzling sun, it seems, had grown genuinely heavy in its later years, and some among your former subjects reportedly greeted the dawn of an entirely new reign with a cautious, thoroughly exhausted sense of hope for something different. It amounts to a genuinely bittersweet epitaph for a man who spent his entire adult life ensuring that every watching eye remained permanently fixed upon him. That even his own eventual death was met with such deeply mingled public feelings. And yet the underlying legend endures, glittering steadily across the intervening centuries that follow. The Sun King remains, to this day, one of the most genuinely famous monarchs who ever lived, standing as the very embodiment of royal absolutism and accumulated splendor throughout Western history. His magnificent palace still stands today as a lasting monument to his extraordinary personal vision and to his equally extraordinary personal ego. You wanted, above absolutely everything else, to be remembered as genuinely magnificent, and in that particular ambition, at least, you succeeded beyond any reasonable measure imaginable. The man himself is long gone from this world, but the sun he so deliberately made of himself continues to cast its considerable light across the pages of recorded history. And so, as the candles finally gutter low and the great palace itself settles slowly into its own uneasy nighttime quiet, our long evening spent together with the Sun King comes gently, finally, to its natural close. What a genuinely strange and dazzling life it truly was. You woke each and every morning before an assembled crowd, were carefully dressed each day by an entire committee squabbling endlessly over a single shirt, dined regularly as a public spectacle for gawking strangers, and strolled leisurely through gardens whose famous fountains only ever dared to dance the very moment you personally drew near them. You ruled, for 72 remarkable years, the single most powerful kingdom anywhere in Europe. And yet you were never once, in all that time, truly permitted to simply be alone, never once allowed to simply exist quietly as an ordinary person in a genuinely quiet room. Behind all of that accumulated gold and all of those endless mirrors, though, there existed real people who genuinely paid the considerable price for that particular splendor. The laborers who died draining a disease-ridden swamp so that a magnificent palace could eventually rise up from it. The peasants who shivered helplessly through recurring famine, while your own royal court continued glittering steadily onward. The patient, overlooked queen who found genuine comfort mainly in her cups of hot chocolate. The gentle young mistress who ultimately fled to a distant convent seeking forgiveness. The countless ordinary souls whose individual names history simply never bothered to properly record for posterity. They endured genuine hardship that we today can scarcely even begin to properly imagine. And yet they endured it all with a quiet stubbornness and inherent grace that still deserves our own thoughtful, quiet respect this evening, so many centuries later. So as you now lie there, warm and comfortable beneath your own blankets, with clean running water waiting patiently from a simple tap, and a door you can simply close quietly against the entire outside world whenever you choose to, spare a soft, quiet thought for all of them tonight. For the ones who built that considerable beauty, and for the ones who ultimately bore its very real cost. Because history, in the end, proves itself to be grand and gilded and more than a little absurd all at once. But it also stands as genuine proof that ordinary people remain remarkably resilient, quietly hopeful, and endlessly, wonderfully human despite everything they endure. The sun has finally set over Versailles this evening. Its famous fountains now stand perfectly still, and you, at long last, can properly rest. Close your eyes now. Let this entire day gently drift away from you. Sleep well, and we will meet again together in another time, another story, another gentle and quiet night.